Hello, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. I love to watch our participant numbers climb in the first few minutes of our start time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Our workshop is being recorded. Valerie Grusing here, Executive Director of NATHPO, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, coming to you from my home office in Silver Spring, Maryland. NATHPO, of course, based in Washington, D.C. And this is the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank peoples. I myself am a descendant of colonizers of North Carolina and remain eternally grateful for the opportunity to do this work and to be here with you today. I'm really excited about this workshop. This is picking up a project that I worked on a number of years ago in my former life when I was at NOAA, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It was funded by BOEM at that time, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and we'll talk a little bit more about efforts on the agency side to pick up where we left off as well. But here at NATHPO, we're doing this workshop, characterizing tribal cultural landscapes, as part of a grant that we've received from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we need to acknowledge our funders for making this possible, keeping it free for workshop participants, which we feel is really important. And it's called Telling the Full History is the name of the grant program. And maybe one of our team members can drop that in the chat box for you so you can go and check out the other list of funded projects as well. There were 80. And we're really honored to be among the cohort of worthy projects that will be doing that will be shining a light on parts of history that have been in the shadows for too long. And we can also put the link to the guidance document that we'll be talking about here today, Characterizing Tribal Cultural Landscapes. The project produced a report in 2 parts, as well as a guidance document, and with a few different models. And we will be walking through the tribal component of that, a template for data collection, which is intended to equip tribes with tools to... Can no one hear me? Sorry. Someone mentioned that they couldn't hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks for that. Equip tribes with tools to characterize their own places of interest on a landscape scale, ideally in advance of proposed undertakings or projects, so that then they would be able to discuss those areas when projects start to come through in ways that are appropriate to them and a level of detail that they are able to share. Of course, we recognize that tribal capacity is an ongoing issue. It's our biggest area of advocacy here at NATHPO, funding for THPO offices. And we'll touch on that a little bit as well. But let's see. I am going to... Thank you to our team members. Please, everyone, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We won't be able to do a round robin with everyone logging on here today. Tell us who you're with, where you're from, and I want to introduce our speakers next. Eric and Brice, if you're able to unmute yourselves. And talk a little bit about how this project came together at the time, as to provide some context. I always love hearing that story from you.
Absolutely. For those who don't know me, my name is Eirik Thorsgard. I'm an enrolled member with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I'm lucky enough to be the regional archaeologist for the Northwest region of the Bureau of Indian Affairs currently. And in my past careers, I've had an opportunity to be a cultural anthropologist for the National Park Service, an archaeologist for the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for my own community, as well as a variety of other roles in cultural resources and education. The creation of this is actually kind of an interesting conversation all on its own, because about a decade ago, The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was proposing to do some offshore leasing development off the Oregon coast and off the entire West Coast. That was an expansion of what they were proposing at the time. And as part of that, they hired a cultural resource firm to do some basic outreach and kind of do their inventory process. And while it was, I guess, part of the normal due diligence of most contracting firms to solicit this, it always rung a little odd, being a tribal member and a tribal employee, having the letters come in saying, hey, we're proposing to maybe do a project. Tell us all of your sacred places inside of this area. And in this case, it was off the entire West Coast for the tribe's area of interest. And after a short conversation in-house, we decided, rather than giving them a list or providing them a means of contacting us in a more appropriate manner, we would send them a proposal for work and an invoice and use that as a leverage point to start a conversation. We honestly didn't think it was going to gain much traction at the time. What ended up happening is a contracting firm took that proposal back to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who managed to find funding. And we expanded the proposal to include tribes from other states that could have been affected. And we created a template study, which is what the proposed project that Val was discussing earlier, the Tribal Cultural Landscapes Project, was. And we brought on the Makah and the Yurok tribes and their THPOs. And each tribe worked together with the agencies and interacting with all of the other tribes that had interests that we could identify on the West Coast to the ocean, and developed the model, the consultation method, and executed our own case studies as a method of showing that this kind of a project and proposal could work. To think about it from a federal perspective, this is kind of doing a 110 inventory. It's about creating the opportunity for participating communities to get funding to do that inventory on their own behalf, so that they can participate meaningfully in the planning process and during undertakings. From a tribal perspective, this is about creating leveraging voice and overwhelming data to ensure that people can address the concerns that are directly relevant to the community, and finding a way that's doing so in a culturally appropriate method. So it kind of had morphed from what was originally a proposal to do our own work rather than having somebody be the intermediary, to us doing a case study on how to do a whole analysis of the landscape at the largest level and identifying the resources of importance. And that template couldn't have happened without the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and Dave Ball, who was the FPO for the Pacific West region at that time, and I believe still currently is, kind of supporting this kind of a study and an analysis. And the unique thing is that not only did we develop the case study and the methodology and then execute the case studies, but all of the information was maintained by the tribal communities. So only the forward-facing reports that BOEM has published is the publicly available information, or what was provided to the agencies. All of the background material and data was kept by the tribes and can be used at any point during any consultations that they want or other development proposals. So that's kind of a snapshot of how we got to how this whole thing came to be. Was a bit of a lark on a consultation process when a federal agency deferred down to a contracting firm. So I don't think Brees has been able to join us yet. Is he yet?
He's been doing a computer restart. There he is.
There we go.
Hello.
Excellent.
I love to hear that origin story. Just more proof that it doesn't hurt to ask.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I learned out of this is not only can these kinds of projects be very beneficial and helpful, but it doesn't hurt sometimes to make a solicitation to an agency, because they may not be able to do anything immediately, but it can result in projects down the road where they're looking for opportunities to partner with communities. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's because they don't know how to ask the questions in the appropriate manner. And so by the tribes making that initiated conversation, it makes it difficult for them to not at least try to make the attempt to look. So at that point, I guess this is the best time to bring in Brees, who is the Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for my tribe, Grand Ronde. and a good friend of mine, and Val, to talk about the BOEM TCL project a decade ago, because they were both integral parts to it.
You want to lead off, Valerie, or would you like me to?
Oh, I already gave a little bit of background while you were logging on. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. As Eric just said, I am Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and manage the Historic Preservation Office here. I was hired by Eric when he was THPO here at Grand Ronde, so we go way back. And I sat in on those meetings that he was referring to. And one of the elements out of those conversations was taking the risk of saying, the question that's being asked is wrong, and it needs to be turned as a question. And in turning the question, we had the opportunity for empowerment. And empowerment of the tribe taking on responsibility for its own knowledge, its own history, and its own future. And that was a very important element that came out of that. And then when we kind of had that moment of, oh, you heard us, then we said, oh, okay, this has application not just here. Where I suspect all of us are understaffed, all doing 20 different jobs and huge workloads with a diversity of responsibility. And so that was one of the elements that we also looked at. This is success here means that we make life a little easier. We're finding information, we're reacquainting community with information that may have been dispersed. And in that, we're bringing some healing back to community. It wasn't just about pushing information outward. It was about making sure that there was information inward and that it would be available and usable in different ways. One thing that we didn't know was just how far afield that diversity of application would become. That ranged, even while we were doing it, we had a big wall-sized map. It was 9 feet tall and something like 20 plus feet in length. And running down the hall of our offices, and we were drawing on it. And as people, elders and community came in, they started adding their own marks on the map. And so just right there, even in the middle of process, there was a moment of reacquainting and of staff learning new, but also community going, oh, that's right. That's probably where Grandpa talked about, or yeah, that's that place. And we were able to just informally see this start to roll. And it was at that moment that I think we kind of looked at each other and said, wow, this is going to be something not just for this specific purpose, but we're going to be able to meet a lot of other needs. I'm going to kind of give a little bit of a teaser for later in this conversation that we did do a part 1, kind of a TCL 1.0. We've just recently completed a 2.0, which became kind of the iterative outgrowth of what our initial study was. And I think out of that helps to demonstrate that application has, its own momentum and really becomes something of value internally. It's great when outside agencies will help with the funding and you are helping fulfill those responsibilities and demonstrate that, yes, the tribe really is its own, expert on itself. But here are other ways that now community are engaging with plants and language and, history through the economy and actions, people, place, and practice going back where it belongs, and seeing that revitalized in an honest way that is appropriate to each community. Did you
Thanks,
want to
Bruce.
add anything?
Yeah, that's great context. And I'll add a little bit more from an overview perspective for the project. When BOEM started to pull all the pieces together, they wanted to do a case study in each West Coast state. So in addition to Bruce and Eric, we also worked with Makah tribe in Washington and the Yurok tribe in California. And they, each tribe hosted an intertribal and interagency workshop at their home. And we worked through a definition of tribal cultural landscapes that's separate and distinct from National Register construct. So that's not necessarily what we're talking about. It's not yet part of statute and regulation. It's, if you look at our guidance document, and Melissa's putting the links in the chat box here for you, what we're talking about is just gold standard of consultation type stuff, steps for relationship building, so that there are channels and relationships in place before, not just before a proposed project, but before there starts to be a problem. And so this is also similar to ACHP's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's early coordination document as well, and their free e-learning training. That has a lot of similar concepts. And so what we'll be working through in this workshop is, as I said, the tribal component, which is a template for data collection. And we recognize that this is not necessarily something that may be the tool that is perfect for everyone. But here at NATHPO, what we're trying to do is provide tools and information and resources to empower THPOs and tribal culture resources staff to better do what they do and be able to speak for themselves, represent their interests and areas in their own voices, and have that seat at the table that's not at the kiddie table. It's at the grown-up table, and it has what you need to do something about it. It has access to the meal, and it has the utensils so that you can partake on equal footing with everyone else. And that's really what this tool was intended to be. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to somehow I got muted. The grant program that is enabling us to hold these workshops through the National Trust. And there's some other really cool projects that are going on that we'll have to keep tabs on and see what they're able to come up with as well. So this will be part one, this workshop, and our part two is yet to be scheduled. We are happy to have this open to everyone. Our part two, we're going to ask that it be limited to tribal participants, so that we will go into breakout rooms and actually help you work through questions and ideas as tribes that you may have for beginning to implement this in your own places and in your own offices. We've also been gratified to see BOEM on the West Coast pick this back up again and start to use the model. The scope of our project was to develop the model and demonstrate through the case studies the value of self-determined methods. Each of the case study tribes decided what work they wanted to do in collaboration with BOEM, what places they wanted to document, and importantly, what methods they wanted to use. And then in the case study, which is the case studies are in part two of the report that Melissa's put here in the chat box, you'll see that one is very long and one is very short. And Bruce and Eric developed a GIS app. And there's just a lot of, there's a wide range of information and of level of detail. And the important point is that that was acceptable to the agency, the work that tribes wanted to do and how, and the level of detail that they wanted to provide. And so BOEM on the West Coast is also picking the model back up now that there are some proposed offshore wind lease areas, and trying to work with tribes in the relevant areas to fund them to put this model into practice, which is really great to see. So what we're going to be doing today is a sort of overview of the model, walking through and using the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde area as their case study, and giving you a better understanding of the model in that way, so that we can have some discussion at the end. And we ask that you, especially if you're planning to attend the part 2, keep questions that you have in mind to help us shape the part 2 workshop for later in the year, so that we can make that as useful to you as possible. And I think that's all of the background and context that I wanted to provide there. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys to do your presentation. And then around, let's see, 2 or 2:30, we're going to take a short break and then reconvene for a discussion period with the last part of our time that we have today.
Excellent. Reese, do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to do mine?
Let's see if technology is playing well this morning.
So as we start getting into this, one thing I do want to note is that this is not meant to be a lecture. If folks have questions, comments, concerns, ideas that pop up during this, please pop something into the chat box, raise your hand, and then we can try to bring it into the conversation. While we're discussing the Grand Ronde case study, overall, part of what we're trying to do is create the opportunity for people to look at how this could be adapted to their own community, so that when we move to the second set of presentations, it's more focused on helping communities identify like which kinds of information are valuable. How do you want to organize this? What are the security protocols? Whose data do you want to use and not use, and why? And we'll discuss some of those things on a broader level today, but we won't get into the nitty-gritty about it.
Bear with me.
No worries.
Am I sharing?
Yes, you are.
Success.
Are we in presentation mode?
Excellent. Could we go? There we go. So we've already gone over the first couple of these slides. And while it may be a little repetitive, I think it's important to go over these. The definition of a tribal cultural landscape was developed under 3 different workshops led by Makah, Grand Ronde, and Yurok inside of their own reservations with tribal communities that had similar interests to the ocean. And so it was pushed through and discussed in every one of those communities, and with many federal agencies who were participating, but ultimately were more in a advisory capacity during those workshops. And it is not meant to be completely and utterly descriptive. It's meant to be adaptable so that a community can identify what that landscape is, how big or how narrow it is, and what resources are important to them. Whether there's something as simple as plants and animals, something as more complex as an archaeological site, a song site, an econom, like a myth place, a place where the creation was done back in the beginning of time. And so some of these things are easy to approach and understand, and some of them are obviously not. And so the ability for a community to define what is important and what is a contributing element to their landscape is really the biggest part of this. Can we go to the next slide? As has already been shared in the case study, the 3 documents that are identified in the next slide, when we get there, are the ones that you guys should be taking a look at. The very first one, the guidance document, is really more about how to fit it into the federal process. And so for federal agents, this might be a useful opportunity to look at this and see how it can engage into the NEPA and NHPA process. One thing I want to say is ultimately the TCL kind of process is best used in a planning, not as a reactive to a 106 process. So if you have to use 106 funding in order to be able to get this started. That's understandable, but ultimately these kinds of tools are best utilized as planning and as longer plan documents and developments. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that we wanted to discuss about those elements being is, and it always came back to a conversation I've had with an elder in our community. And I won't share her name because she's always made it a point that she would rather her words carry weight rather than her name. So I'll let it be what it is. I asked her one time, we were having difficulty explaining what culture was to a federal agency. And in this case, it was actually discussing with the National Park Service what a TCP is or isn't. And I asked her, I said, can you tell me what is our culture? Like, how do I explain that to somebody from outside of our community? And she got a little agitated. She said, you tell me what it isn't. It's the air I breathe. It's the water I drink. It's the food I eat. It's the stories I tell. It's the way I live my life. It's everything. It's not my job to tell you what my culture is. You tell me what it isn't. And it dawned on me that when we were looking at things under the 106 process, we weren't being holistic. We weren't being inclusive of all of these other elements of tribal life that needed to be included. And some of them are kind of benign things like traditional foods, traditional activities like canoeing or fishing, the ability to do carving, the ability to visit important places in the landscape because they're connected to our creation stories, right? Our economy. And we intentionally use that word, and we will continue throughout this rather than the term myth, because it's in our language and it means more than myth. Myth would be an English approximation, but unfortunately English is a limited language and doesn't do a real good descriptive. And thank you, Larry, for bringing that up in the chat box, because that is an important thing. As part of this, I think it's also really important for tribal communities, as we move to the next slide, to think about language and the methodology, right? What data is good data? Where is it? How do we go about it? Getting it, organizing it, protecting it. Do we want to use English? Do we want to use our own descriptions because they're more apt and are the only way to holistically explain what this resource is? And if that's the case, how do we create context for someone who doesn't have access to that information? Where do we go to get this information? Simple reminders like our elders and community members that are often cultural practitioners, or maybe who even aren't regular cultural practitioners, may have vital cultural information that gets overlooked because we don't ask the right question at the right time. And so making sure that we go back often to our own community and reassess what information we're getting, because they'll reinforce what we do and don't know. Georeferencing this data, identifying how it's connected to the community. Are there additional interviews that need to be done with elders or ones that have been missed accidentally? Figuring out how do you create a narrative for a place? And is everything included? And is it included in a culturally appropriate manner? And if we have to share this data outside, what is appropriate to share and what isn't? And how do the elders and culture holders help us in that process to identify what is and isn't appropriate? And then not only that, but remembering ultimately that tribes are the authority on their own history. And I think this is the biggest piece of this. So for the TCL process to work, an agency or a contractor cannot do this work. It has to be community-based participatory research, which means if the tribe or community of origin is not doing the research, that the researcher is identified by them and working in partnership with the community for their own needs to work through this process and identify this methodology that is appropriate for them, right? And the reason is that ultimately the tribe has to have the authority to define themselves and their own history. And while we may have some folks that want to argue about history is owned by the person who writes the narrative, ultimately the narrative tends to write only one perspective. And for tribes, that lack of perspective disentangles our ability to be included in the conversation. And so the TCL process is about creating that overwhelming level of data again, so that tribes can re-engage in the process at the same level that other partners are, because often we're behind the ball. We're not involved in the planning process at the same level that we should. We're not involved in the implementation and often even in the reaction process. So Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that always interested me is looking at these resources and trying to get a handle at identifying them. And so to kind of think about this, the Grand Ronde version, iteration 1.0, the way we started going about this is we identified every single place that had a place name. We identified every single place that we could identify a tribal member doing a cultural activity: hunting, fishing, living in a landscape, pre and post contact, mapped it into the area. Every time a tribal member talked about gathering a plant or an animal or a mineral, we identified where it was, in which book, and geo-referenced it if we could. And then we looked at archaeological sites. And as you can see by the graphic here on the photos on the right with the maps, the information just starts to become overwhelming once you start to overlay it. It shows this really rich, kind of complex overlay of cultural use patterns. And this is just the raw data, mind you. It doesn't give you the nuance of what each activity is and everything. And Brees can get into the details of that later on. And then the picture on the left was, I wanted to see from one of our Tillamook community, the biggest epic that we have is the Southwind epic. And it's kind of the creation story of how the world was laid out. And so that economy, seeing it mapped out was, I think, valuable for us because we had been accustomed to identifying things based in the way Tillamook tribal members identified things to us. And because of the relocations and the lack of ability to maintain activity in the landscape, our footprint looked dramatically smaller than it originally did. The ethnographic landscape made it even smaller than that, as identified by ethnographers. And yet when we just took the creation story, you can see that we stretched inland really far and far north into Washington with just how the landscape was laid out by these creator figures, Southwind, before people even came into existence. And so the Tillamook world is much larger than what's been confined to them. And again, this is right going back to the tribe and the community. And this is me as a tribal member from Grand Ronde, realizing that our own data was limiting ourselves because we weren't looking at it holistically and asking tribal members sometimes the right things. Or even going back and looking at our own stories and how they place us in the landscape. And all of a sudden, our world became much larger and our concerns became much broader. And I think at that point, I would love to kind of switch over and let Brees kind of start talking about the next steps in the project and how it went about. And please remember, folks, if you have questions, comments, or anything, please jump in, let us know or raise your hand, and we can address it as we're moving along.
Okay, I'm actually going to reuse some of your slides here. So let's see if I can. There we go. One of the key elements in the process that we took, and I want to call out that, yes, you're only hearing one of three examples. It's an example that I think has success, and we've had lots of one-on-one conversations with other tribes over the past several years. And I want to start out by saying this is just one approach. There were the other two examples in that BOEM-based or BOEM-funded study. So what was key is every tribe having the opportunity to develop and consider what works best for them. So from the very beginning, developing the system that is the fit for the information, for community, how information is held, how information is shared. And for Grand Ronde, that's, we chose to work in a very digital platform for many reasons. One of those reasons is that it helps serve as an archive, a place-based archive, which was something that was important then and has become a cornerstone of how we operate and engage with other agencies now. So one of the elements that I wanted to kind of draw attention to then is this, the conceptualization that looks different for everybody. And I encourage everybody to take a few moments or days or however long it needs to be to consider what your resources are. How many staff, how many volunteers, how is information captured already? How do you, what's appropriate for being, held in, and for what purposes? We put a lot of time into that. I think we spent several weeks kind of going around with some of those questions. But with that consideration at the beginning, it helped make everything after that much more honest, and it brought the information together in a cohesive way. It allowed us to present edges as well, to how far out were we going to push. So I encourage everybody to give that some time. Talk amongst yourselves, talk amongst the appropriate people in your communities. While doing that, consider what you want the application to be. There's the immediate, the kind of mid-range, and then there's that horizon point. Is your approach something that you want to see go through iterative development, or kind of a one and done for that'll stay set for 10 years? There are different ways of approaching that. So we gathered a lot of information. We really took the principles of people, place, and practice. And that can translate to who, where, and what. And they, translated into a Western language. We were very conscious that we wanted to get as close to first person historic language and understanding. So with that, we used ethnohistoric records, ethnographer surveys, and interviews that brought forward community language, community perspectives. And by taking that approach, we were able to be honest to, I think it was Larry that brought up, these aren't myths. You're right, absolutely. And we internalize that in our process by simply saying, this is a history. If we take the word oral history and break it down, it's just a history. It's what, it's the format. I think we're all experienced with that. It has helped us by giving it attention and parsing that out to develop the language sets for having the conversations with agencies that, no, stop seeing these as stories. It's history. Stories get relegated to Beatrix Potter not as a fiction. No, this is just a history. It's a nonfiction. And it's to the tribe to define where its edges of application are, not agency X. So that was part of what we started to see emerge out of this. So just the process of engaging with developing the TCL helped us reposition, and it forced us into considerations and to make decisions and have those amazing, oh, wow, yes, it's just that simple of calling out. It's just a history. Stop thinking of it as a fiction. That's your Western lens that's getting imposed here. That's a you thing.
That devaluing of tribal history, and let's make it clear, when an agency or individual devalues oral history, they're devaluing tribal history. It's often because of a misconception of its value. And I will honestly say that I believe that is a result of a myopic education that reinforces that Western ideology of dominance because it has the written word. It does not make it a better form of history. It simply makes it more acceptable to the common dominant culture. So for cultural communities that are based in oral tradition, it doesn't need to be written in a book. And in fact, writing it in a book doesn't make it any truer. It simply is the way that our elders tell us, right? I've heard this saying by elders, "Ikush iwa," it is what it is. Like, just let it be. And so, for agencies to accept that, sometimes tribes have to use an overwhelming amount of data. And like Brees was saying, when we started this, I remember having a conversation about a telecommunications development off of Neocani Mountain, a location that's mentioned in these stories as the birthplace of ice, another creator figure in the Tillamook worldview. And when I called the agency and said, "Hey, I want to have a conversation about this. This is a religious place." They showed up with like 5 lawyers and 2 archaeologists and their project manager, and it was just me. And I was like, "Oh, wow, this is really overwhelming." And so I went into the library in my office and pulled out the Nehalem Tillamook Tales and just opened it up to the very first page and said, "Can you read the very first sentence off of that book?" And they said, "And Ice began his journey at Neocani Mountain." Said, "So before we begin, an anthropologist wrote this down long before I was born, that this was an important religious location." And it made everyone in the room quiet. The lawyers didn't want to say anything, right? Because I had used the academia against them in one simple sentence in a book. And so when we started looking at the TCL, it was about contextualizing stuff like that so that it was easy to bring to bear when an agency said, "That's not important," or "That's not valuable." Well, then why did your people write it down too? And not once, but 6 times in 6 different ways, all saying basically the same thing. And so utilizing all of that we used it as a weapon. We weaponized academia and the written word in order to leverage our oral tradition.
And that really is, Eric's jumped to the punchline. What good is doing this? And it is about re-empowering, taking back empowerment, and then delivering that empowerment back out appropriately. And this is a mechanism for doing that. Our approach was very driven by geographic information system. We used GIS in part because it is a language that spans agencies. And when you can make cool, pretty maps better than the agency can, it carries weight. It's very simple.
Its working draft, though, was a big map, like Brees described earlier, with a Visqueen overlay that we scribbled on and then scanned in georeference. So that if we wanted to interview elders, we didn't have GIS on a computer screen. We had a huge map that they could walk it on and that they could go, "Oh, this is where this is. And we used to go hunting over here. And over there's this. And oh, I can't tell you about this." And then there would be another 20-minute conversation to see if we could get them to elucidate. So, it's being able for people to feel like they're in the landscape makes it easier for them to share too, because they can see what they're doing. Tribal members and practitioners often don't realize that their activities are cultural activities because they're so mundane and part of their everyday perspective. And so you kind of have to sometimes get people to think about it from an outsider's perspective to describe it. Because when I'd ask elders in Grand Ronde, "Oh, did you ever do any tribal cultural activities?" "Oh, no, we never did anything like that." "Oh, did you guys ever go berry picking?" "Oh, yeah, we go berry picking over there, and we go root picking over there, and then we go over here to clean the graves on Memorial Day." And I'd be like, "That's all cultural activities. What are you saying you don't do any?" And so, for people who are doing it every day, it doesn't seem special, but it is.
Yep. And that is one of those amazing discovery moments that we had as more and more people heard about this map that was up on the wall, and without exaggeration, it was 20 feet in length. I think it was 1 inch to a mile. And people found ways to come in and engage and provide their own understanding. And our start point was, if you're telling us it is of value, that was it. it was very simple. It's a 1 or a 0. So everything that was shared with us became a 1. And that was, to be honest, that was understanding. And by having the understanding that is of tribal origin, and that therefore, when I'm sitting across the table and talking with people that want to put cell towers in significant places, I now have a stack of 1s that make reference to that single place. It's not just one family, it's multiple families, because the tribe it's families for here. That may be a different composition for others. I'm going to kind of step forward a little bit in what our process was, that in that 1s and 0s element, if it's said and it's made reference to, oh yeah, we did that, when I was a kid, that's still a 1. It doesn't need to be old to be of value or to be reflective of significance. And
so
that
from a perspective, it's an ongoing, continued cultural activity. So a lot of times what we were doing by that kind of thing is tracking that a tribe member has been continuing the same type of activity at that same location in perpetuity since the beginning of our history. And if we can show modern activity as well as historic activity, as well as prehistoric activity, it makes it really hard to refute our interests.
Completely. And it then also starts to set, any of the THPOs here that are used to those reports, and you get the 2 paragraphs of pre-contact, and then you get the 20 pages of 50 years of colonial action. This is one of my favorite graphics. Yeah, this is you. Why is it a disproportionate writing? People have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and yet you're going to relegate it to 2 paragraphs, and you're only going to speak about it archaeologically. That is showing your bias. Where is that true reflective understanding? And this is one of my favorite ways of bringing that forward, is when we look at people sharing information and we have the conversations, or we look at the historic ethnographic record, we're seeing that, yes, they're told in a moment in time, but that moment in time only exists because of every generation before them shared it. So from 1890, that may be when the story was captured, when it was caught in writing, but that story, that history, is in perpetuity backward in time, and therefore it can be in perpetuity going forward. In fact, there's an obligation to make sure that that occurs, and that's that reacquainting element that, Grand Ronde was a terminated tribe and suffered greatly under U.S. doctrine. As a result, it continues to reacquaint with its own history, and this has actually helped provide some of that opportunity and bring it into action.
It becomes a community remembrance
Yes.
in a certain word case, because in the case of Grand Ronde, because of the diaspora that occurred from termination, a lot of that cultural information became more fractionalized into separate, different families at a higher rate because of people having to leave the reservation. So for communities that don't have that kind of impact, a lot of times their information is easier to access because it's been more integrally maintained in a community. But for Grand Ronde, it was a need to grab back in these community members that had forgotten how important they were, and making them remember that their story is as much of an element of the tapestry of our community as those stories that have been maintained by those really vocal members of the community as well. And so by getting that full tapestry, we really started to get a better perspective of the broad base of tribal interest and how how important it was, especially for certain species and access points, for either religious or cultural activities or even other benign things.
And which is perfect tee up for this next slide. This is, for instance, again, based on a portion of the information that Grand Ronde pulled together for its TCL study. We divided the information, there's a data capture step. That may be oral histories or sitting with elders or just inward reflection. But we sat down and we went line by line in those ethnohistoric records.
To put that into perspective, we pulled in interns and tribal members and tribal youth that we got through like voc rehab and youth employment funding, as well as unpaid interns from local universities, and went through over 300 published and unpublished ethnographic notes, documents, historical already written narratives, unpublished and locally published narratives from local historical societies, old oral histories that had been done by the tribe and never been transcribed, ones that had been, and new interviews. So it was like everything. If it mentioned any tribe or tribal member that had been mentioned, we tried to get it and get it included. And I mean everything.
Line by line. And so it was, and it's in detail in of the case study report that I think a link was put in. Out of that, there was a primary effect and then there was a secondary effect. The primary effect was we were able to capture information in a way that brought it into one place. It made it accessible for reference. I think immediately we started using the information as it was captured and brought in to the GIS or into spreadsheets. And we then were able to start to see, oh, there are a lot of these references there. And we divided very simply animal, mineral, vegetable, and other. And a single sentence may make reference to all four. And so that single sentence would go into 4 different spreadsheets with specific reference, and we would identify what is the key word that we're highlighting. So you're seeing here just, and this was, I think, well, these numbers have all grown since this slide was created several years ago, because it's become an ongoing updating. But out of the fauna, the animals spreadsheet, we had over 1,000 mammals, and I'm going to just kind of go into the mammals. We then had the secondary discovery moments, and in this case, it was, as we anticipated, yes, ungulates, elk and deer were the #1 mammal mentioned. The #2 mammal that was mentioned was actually whale, and that became very significant in a secondary way. It had been long held by academic researchers of the area that whaling off of the Oregon coast was a secondary opportunistic action. And looking at the data, and we're back to unpaid intern, working with that was an undergrad at the time and taking a class on coastal archaeology, and he was doing the data entry, and he caught the pattern and he said, is this right? Because I'm being taught this other thing. And he said, well, that's what elders are sharing. That's what the sources are saying. Yes, that
Go
is
find
right.
out.
And so we turned him loose and we said, yes, please explore this. Challenge what the popular narrative is. He's now since received his PhD and he had a full ride. He was a very smart individual to begin with, but he was also encouraged to go forth and do good work. And so as an undergrad, he got access to a collection at the Smithsonian, brought that information forward, and has written several articles now turning the understanding of tribal cultural uses and actions regarding whaling off of the Oregon coast. And out of it came the question, why is there this popular belief that tribes weren't whaling on the coast? And it was a glaring answer. It's still hypothesized, but I think he's right. And it's quite simple. There weren't white people around to see it. Therefore, it didn't get written down, even though every tribal member, every tribal history makes note that that is what was going on. And the evidence is right there. And it's tribes are their own experts. And this is why I share this as an anecdote, both that it was a secondary kind of ripple effect of this information. And secondly, it has taken root. He's changed the narrative as a result. New research that's occurring is starting to readdress, oh, is it only because it's absent from the record because nobody's chosen to look, because we're relying on dominant cultural understandings that are being imposed.
Looking at it from a kind of legislative legal framework for the 106 process, part of the reason that we wanted to record these is that for those of you who take the opportunity to read through the case studies in the volume 2, on page 48, there's a quote from Blue Jay who says, the ocean, he's king, he's the chief of all chiefs. And for the Tillamook worldview, the ocean is Ikani, like it is sacred, because it's the birthplace and the covenant between those divine figures and the food chain and people. And so it has to maintain a relationship. And things like whaling are a contributing element to that historic property of cultural and religious significance to the community, which is the ocean. And while that may be very hard to fathom about from a perspective of size and scope, for the community whose entire economic and social life was built on access to a maritime economy, it's understandable that the ocean becomes important.
Absolutely. And kind of out of this, we start to see out of these, we can start to make reference back to things like migrations and seasonality. What are those associated actions? And as well as the connection and the breadth of area. And that all then becomes applicable in that regulatory consultative moment where you can sit there with the empowerment of all of this and bring it into the conversation as not just ones and twos of information, but here is a collective understanding, and more appropriately, here is what cumulative effect may be. So in that, you're seeing a moment of moving or bridging from a 106 perspective to a NEPA-wide perspective. So you're bringing in the cultural resources element and now making it a greater empowerment within NEPA process. So what does that actually look like? And what you're seeing here is a translation of a lot of information. And that is in many ways one of the most significant elements, I believe, in the approach that we took, was we were not going to hand over raw data. Nobody gets to see that. That is inward only. That's for community, that's for staff. But then with that, we have the obligation of how do we make it relevant for conversations, for consultation, for those actions that are occurring out in place. So for us, I mentioned that we made everything a 1 or a 0. We didn't weight things. What we did was we let gravity be based on how many times a place was mentioned. So every place winds up being important. Some places just have a greater gravity than other places. What we did then was we used viewshed because viewshed was very significant in this area. So we took our stacked elements of gravity and we ran viewsheds amongst all of those places of importance. And we found, so we did that for all of the animals places, all of the archaeological places, all of the language places, all of the botanical places. And then we ran intersects of those viewsheds. And what we found is where a place is that has intersections of importance in itself is important. And that allowed us the translation. I can share this information. And what I can say is where it's very bright in red, there are over 1,000 referenced places that are visible from that place. That makes that place important. It also means anything that occurs here has the potential to affect 1,000 other places, cumulative effect. Now, that provides the opportunity to say, and ultimately answer selectively, what are those 1,000 places? And that is where control of the information is vital. But also a moment of self-determination. You can choose to share or go, no, but we can tell you that there are named places of that South Wind created, or there are known gathering places.
The idea to think about is that these maps aren't a fix under a 106 process, under a local zoning, or even under a major planning effort. What they are is a useful methodology to create an opportunity for conversation between project proponents and the tribe who has a TCL that has some ability to have georeferenceable data. And the reason that Grand Ronde built this is, again, like Bree said, we wanted it to be intergenerational. We wanted it to not be lost. At the time, 10 years ago, when I was working for the tribe, I would commonly refer and joke that I'm training everyone to be my replacement. And the reason I would say that is because I was well aware that we never know what life will bring us, and opportunities and things may change the desires or the focus that we have. And I wanted to make sure that if I left, nothing of the work that I had done would leave that community, and that all of that good work would be able to be built on by anyone who took up behind me. And it has been, and it's been perfected and refined. And as you can see, these maps create opportunities for both federal and state and local agencies to converse with the tribe and create an opportunity to them have a focal point. Does it fix all the issues? No. Does it create a starting point? Yes. And ultimately, sometimes that is the hardest thing to get, is enough data to be able to force people to come to the table to have a conversation.
Absolutely. And it's that.
So we have a question from Megan about the time depth. So here's the thing. We don't differentiate on the time depth with this, because everything in history is culminating in the moment of today. We are the living expression of our ancestors, and everything that they've done is the mark that creates the culture that we have today. And so we don't see it as a break. It's a continuation of practice. And so when the community was discussing organizing the data, we understand that there are things that happen during the economy. There are times that happen during the ancestral time and the historical and during the contemporary time, but we don't differentiate and we don't map them out differentially because they each affect each other and are interrelated with each other.
Yeah, we've got another question that just came in.
One concern is that I have being a compliance within tribal bylaws on contracts, self-transactions with agencies, and not violate them. Yeah, and contracting language with these things can be difficult. If you're interested in the way that the language was constructed for the original studies, I would really encourage folks to reach out to Dave Ball at BOEM. Val and some of the folks here at NATHPO could potentially share his contact information or maybe find some information to share about that. We'll follow up on that for folks. The other thing you could do is that the Udall Foundation is currently working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and there are 3 case study areas that are currently being looked at on the West Coast: Humboldt Bay, Morro Bay, and the Oregon coast.
Yeah.
And so those, the Udall Foundation is working through the contracting methodology right now with a bunch of different tribes. And so those methodologies on how the TCL can be funded will be more clear for other agencies in the near future after the Udall Foundation has kind of helped navigate the process a little bit more thoroughly. Currently, there is a method through BOEM to do it, but it's mostly done through the Ocean Studies program, which is kind of like an advanced studies program. The best comparable that I know of is at the National Park Service with some of the, there's like some cluster groups that do stuff for cultural and natural resources. The cultural resources one has some 110 inventories. And that would be the best comparable that I could think of with another agency currently.
Yeah, I would also point out that, you know, I want to come back to the contract element, and that is you can contract and identify what the deliverable is. We identified that we would provide a translation, that the base data resided or would reside with the community. And that, you know, what is the goal? Is the goal to get into the tribe's business and knowledge? No, the goal is to have, for the BOEM case, a workable product that could facilitate conversation. So that is really, you know, my grandma used to say, everything has an answer if you've got enough time to look for it. And that may mean getting select in the language of the contract in identifying how you limit what the deliverable is so that the information stays proprietary to the tribe, whereas not, you know, becomes somebody else's product. Yeah.
Yeah, maintaining the base data that's collected ultimately has to be maintained by the community. And that's where one of the unique things about this is for an agency to fund a tribe in a 110 inventory and them to maintain the integrity and the base data and to provide an interpretation or a baseline document that talks about the methodology that was used and maybe some simple sets of the data to show how it was constructed. Yep. The idea is that this creates the equal footing between a consulting party and the agency. And ultimately what we found a lot of times when I was the THPO at Grand Ronde is that agencies at that time felt very projects were self-determinative. They came to the tribes to meet a consultation requirement to check a box. And to force the conversation, we often had to use overwhelming data to force them to look at their project as if it was going to be unsuccessful from the beginning. And so we would overwhelm them and show all the problems with their project. And then we would start to help them navigate a process of how to ameliorate the community's concerns. But we also made a point of not bringing up those concerns unless we had a way of being able to at least make a recommendation out, even if it was completely unfeasible. And the reason is that we wanted to make sure that it was a conversation topic. The takes and impacts, to contextualize this, and for those folks who are working for an agency, like myself, you know, take this with a grain of salt. Cultural resource management is a political exercise. We write the history of other people and take that away from them to do for themselves. It is a point of self-determination that is completely stripped of communities. And unfortunately for Indigenous communities, that's at a higher level. The ability for those communities to exercise self-control and to wrestle that data back into their own control and then to define themselves and to tell the outside world what is important to them is absolutely paramount for them to be able to identify themselves in perpetuity. And so that's what this is about creating an equal footing so that the tribes became the ultimate purveyors of their own history and the owners of said data and could choose what they wanted to share on a case-by-case basis in consultation, but that the federal agency in the case of the TCL was providing some upfront funding. Now, having said that, it's never sufficient. So that's the other caveat, right? Is that even if you get funding, it's likely not going to be sufficient for the level of work. But to get back into the conversation.
Yep. And I think those are really good points, and I don't want to lose track of those. I think that when we get into the discussion, we can really start to drill into that a little bit. I did want to bring up, I mentioned that there was a 2.0 version. And this goes to, I think, your question, Megan, about where where can you get a hold of that graphic with the timeline? So we did we had a contract with Army Corps, and we did basically a 2.0 study. We took, but in a different landscape. So building on the original methods, we'd come a long way in 8 years, 10 years of methods and software and new information and new sources of information. And so we set out and we said, okay, we're going to apply the same thing, but our deliverable is going to be, in essence, a grade card using cultural resources information writ large, capital C, capital R, which would
includes these biotic components, right? That we're mentioning earlier, plants and animals that have cultural value.
Yep. And that was really key.
Okay.
One of the things that we set out to do was we wanted to bring the economy, those origin, narratives, those epics of coyote and cougar and others into place, and how to do that. What we chose was we took landscape environment elements. So taking the plants basically out of those epics as indicators of connection to that place. So if vine maple is significant in a story, then places that would be prime habitat for vine maple and all of the practices that go with it, therefore, are directly connected. So access then to, and the propagation and encouragement of vine maple is in many ways an opportunity of staying connected to, coyote or cougar or whomever. So what
you
we
see
did
how
was,
cultural resource management, all of a sudden, Brees is talking about, isn't about management of archaeological sites. It's about access to ongoing continued cultural practice, as well as how it relevantly connects with the past.
exactly. And so with that, what we did was we went out, we identified using the same data sets plus new information as before. And then we evaluated how accessible and how healthy are these landscape elements. If community wanted to go back out and gather huckleberries or pigments, or how accessible, how safe, what are the hindrances to those actions? And here is an example of an area on the left. High scores are nice and yellow. This is a very high score and great if you're a mountain goat. It is not accessible, but it still has ideal landscape habitat, as well as connection to the economy. Down here within viewshed of this, it's poor score. None of the resources, plant resources, cultural practice opportunities are available. They're just, you get a couple of hot spots and they're fairly weak.
Is that Baby Rock?
South.
South, yeah. Okay.
What we see is, and behind this, we did actually add weights and values. And we said, and there's a narrative that goes with this, with modification of these elements, changing access, limiting public access, even seasonally, starts to bring that grade card up. So this is, again, it's a translation of the same sort of information, but it is made very applied. It becomes a mechanism that is to say, we know how to make this better. We know how to help you, the manager, the agency with the trust responsibilities, like a good airline, counter staff, help me help you. We're trying to help the agency get to a better grade, because if we can, that's a success for community. They don't have that knowledge. At the technical level, individual staff are generally pretty quick to say, you're right, you are your own expert. I just don't know how to be better at my job because I have all of these edges. So here is an applied way to bring forward a mechanism that others can work within their edges. It's still
And
doing their
again,
job for
for
them.
those agents, oh, sorry to jump in, Bruce. For those folks who are having a hard time thinking about this, this is a landscape level approach that can identify areas of potential, right, TCPs, potential locations of historical and cultural significance to tribes or NHOs, or can identify contributing elements to one of those said ones. This is also a methodology that a tribe could use to do an ethnographic landscape under the NPS.
Yep.
Although in this case study, it would have to be executed by the tribe rather than by the NPS or a contractor.
Completely. Now, if I can now bring this back in, we're very fortunate here with being able to have the resources that we can conduct this sort of study. And there may be those listening going, that's great. I just have 5 other priorities, like any nation, that have to come before this. And so how do I do this? And the answer is, you don't need to necessarily think of this as a whole landscape area. We're doing another project now that is really just one small tertiary watershed of a larger watershed system. And it's significant. There's enough information, but it's a start point for understanding that area. So you can scale this by area. You can scale it by the choices of information that you choose to capture or that are available to be caught. You have the opportunity to scale by, maybe it's just a resource specific approach. There are mechanisms or ways of looking at this that may help scale it in. Another way is to say, I'm not able to do this over in the next 6 months. I'm still in fire control mode. I've got 20 things hitting me every week and 5 get my attention. So this may become an approach that you can consider for off season, if there ever is one. Or if you have those inquiries from others.
Think about inventive ways that you, and I think it's important to think about inventive ways internally that you might be able to do this. Could you partner with the TARO program? Is there a Voc rehab program where there's people who want to potentially get paid to read through old data or interview elders and would be willing to get trained to do it? Is there a youth employment program? Is there an NPS grant that you could go after that would help you do some kind of an inventory that's maybe on or off reservation? Is a federal agency like BOEM proposing a large scale action that you could ask for funding to do some kind of a landscape level study, whether you want to term it a TCL or term it into something that's more appropriate for your own community is completely up to you. But again, the methodology is about trying to create opportunities for tribes to consolidate data so that they can use it as a leveraging tool in these kinds of consultation and identifying things of importance to them in the landscape, right? And I think one of the coolest things I've listened to over this is when we start these, usually start thinking about archaeological sites and, features, and all of a sudden now Brees is not talking about the archaeological component. He's talking about plants and animals of cultural value and use in the landscape and how they're tied to our economy and how they're tied to access today and traditional use. And that change in the philosophical approach of how cultural resource management is, I think, is more indicative of where tribal concerns tend to be.
And that right there is one of those successes, I believe, out of this. I'm sure that virtually everybody, all 109 of us, have had those frustrations of, there is no edge between, cultural and natural resource. That's a you issue. Why are you imposing it onto this community? But here is now an opportunity to bridge that for others. Again, it's part of that as a host of your lands. This could be considered part of host responsibilities, to be responsible for the information, to meet the other where they are at. They may only have a small cup and you may have a lot of water pour into it. And so you may have to pour slow. But part of being a good host is to remind your guests what their obligations are also. And sometimes agencies don't catch on to maybe that they are a guest, and soft reminders that, hey, you do need to hear where we are, that salmon is resource. You're imposing this division. Salmon just is, and we have obligation to salmon. Salmon does a lot for everybody. So
things like that, a keystone species can be, I think, one of the hardest things sometimes for a tribal community to talk about as a cultural resource, right? Because there's a cyclical relationship between that and people and how it defines itself in a landscape. And even back into our economy, right? So like for Grand Ronde, we have a story about Wonderful Boy, who's a young man who got transformed into the first salmon. And he runs up the Willamette River and goes up a very specific branch of the Willamette River, which is where the only salmon runs happen, really of any concentration. And so our myths tell us where our places to gather are. They tell us why our relationship is with these animals and why that relationship is so deep. It also reminds us of things like, for a lot of tribes that are off the Columbia River branches, we have a prophecy that when the salmon quit running, we as people won't exist anymore. And so the idea that salmon not running up the rivers is horrifying. Even if I can't eat it, I have to have those salmon there because that's part of who I am.
And this can become a way to help bring that forward with the gravity of that reality. And that is part of what we've also taken as an approach is it is a gravity, it is a reality. And we use this to change vocabulary across the board. So not artifacts, these are belongings. They weren't given to you, therefore they are the belongings of those families today. These are not stories as fiction, they are histories. These are epics of actions that have shaped the landscape, and there is truth in them. When we were the same way that there are truths in the Epic of Hercules, and that borne out. Herodotus talks about these great myths of the East and the
I've touched the heart of Wishpush, which was a giant monster that was cut apart by Coyote Spelei back in the economy, and it turned to stone when he cut it out of it. And it still sits in a landscape way up on the Nez Perce reservation to today. You can see it, Coyote's handiwork, right? So those kinds of things are reinforcing locations or allegories to these stories that connect us to the landscape. And then it's the execution of the culture in the landscape that contextualizes it.
And a reminder that we accept this from Western traditions, the realities of these places that were 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old. We accept some of those loci as being real today. So why is it that there is a push to deny the same legitimacy of tribal place? And this again is as a template can be applied or can bring that forward in conversation as by choice. one of the things I want to come back a step now, and that is that scale. One of the first questions and forever questions now is, how big is a TCL? And our answer quickly became, it's bigger than a canoe and it goes as far as you know. So worldview does not need to be confined to a narrow area. I haven't been to Moscow, but I know it exists. I know that actions that occur there have impact throughout the world. Therefore, Moscow is part of a worldview for me in a very contemporary way. So actions and knowledge of places outside of one's homelands are still a point of connection. And this is not to then start arguing whose land or whose territory at all. It's just simply to say, here's the opportunity for a single tribe's understanding of what and where this place of engagement is. For Grand Ronde, sometimes that might be reference to hunting buffalo in the Midwest. But yeah, that's part of the worldview. There are stories about that. That does not mean that I'm providing comment on every FCC tower that's going on over there. No, thank you. So those are just kind of opportunities through this and ways of knowing it can be large. It can be thematic. You can narrow it in a number of ways. And I see that
one of the THPOs mentioned about, looking at these things from a landscape level, being able to identify individual TCPs, their interrelationship, right? So if we were to bring up the graphic of, actually, maybe I can bring it up, hold on. The South Wind epic, when we look at it, and let's see here.
I got it.
Oh, do you have it? Excellent. So when we look at that, a vast majority of each one of these individual locations could be considered an individual TCP, because South Wind or Ice or another creator figure interacted with South Wind at that location, and in most cases either modified an animal or the landscape in some way to make it the way it is today. Altogether, it could be a district, a non-contiguous district. There's all sorts of ways of looking at this if you're trying to think about it from that kind of a perspective. And there's obviously tangible and intangible elements to this, right? The route that he took is meandering. It's not clear cut. Why did he do that in that method and manner? And why did he go so far inland only to come back out and to sacrifice himself at the very end so far south? There's things that sometimes are buried in that cultural knowledge that can't be elucidated out for the general public. And I think when the community is engaging these and you get these really rich components of culture and how they weave into the landscape, and they create, for lack of a better term, our Bible, because we don't have a written language or don't have the need for it, is not written in a book. It's written in the landscape by these figures and by the stories that our ancestors have told since the last 400 generations. And in order to be able to tell that story or to live it, you have to be able to visit those locations and be able to comport that to the next generation. And so getting people to understand that the erasure of each individual page may seem like not a big issue, but over time, entire chapters start to become disappeared. And at what point becomes the difficulty of transferring that information to the next generation when so many of your chapters and pages have been stolen, and you can kind of give the impression, but the story's context has been removed because somebody bulldozed it or had to build something there. And so the ability to develop this narrative in its holistic, as well as the ability to break it down to its individual location, was really valuable for us, because it was hard to make that jump for people. For us, it was easy. It was a non sequitur, but we were ingrained in it every day and talking to elders and and trying to do the work and get people to listen. For agency folks, it was about trying to find a way to create enough data for us to share with them to get them to understand and have that context. And the TCL was the methodology that we found that worked. It doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody, but because it was successful and because it's continued to be successful, and is even being replicated by BOEM, not only again on the West Coast, but they did it in Hawaii as well. It shows that the methodology has some value and is useful in being looked at by other communities so that they can adapt it to their needs. So again, while the ability to do this can be a long-term project and maybe one of those things that could run for years or maybe even decades in the background, it is also something that could be an individual large-scale project. Grand Ronde was lucky enough during the BOEM TCL upfront to get that. And we were lucky enough to partner in with educational organizations that had free interns, which I think gave us an unfair advantage to be able to get through so much historical data. I think it's important that tribes who want to think about these kinds of holistic studies, because they're such a big data grab, and I mean, really they are, it does take a lot of labor, and it's important to think about it and plan it and to be aware of whether this is a short-term or a long-term project, and to think about the areas of focus that you need to have, because your community's needs are going to be dramatically different than the ones that Grand Ronde had at the time that I was there, and are different then than they are now, where I'm working at the agency now, and Brees is there helping my community navigate this process, you know, and so things change and adapt, and the ability to have the information, no matter who's sitting at the table, allows the community to be able to exercise control over the narrative, exercise over access to it, and the ability to control, the ability to consult in a meaningful manner, right? Because they have all the information that they need to share, and it's just about the tribe choosing what is appropriate to share and when at that point. And when a tribe's in that position, it puts them in a much better footing to be able to actually meaningfully consult. But often, because of funding and the way projects are, there's not the ability to do this kind of large scale data grab, and tribes are often working in a triage capacity. So, you know, this is, and we're all aware of the reality, but again, we wanted to point this out because it's the ability to look at things on a larger scale and let our own communities define their space. Just letting the Tillamook and Clatsop and Chinook people define their own space was much bigger than it had ever been even interpreted by our own community, until we let them have an unfettered voice and just said, we're not going to tell you, you tell us what it isn't. So they elucidated what everything that needed to be included, and then we all of a sudden understood the spatial ranges of where the community's interest was, both in a historical context and in the modern.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on one of the key underlying elements in this, is that how does meaningful consultation occur? And having the diversity of this sort of information, whether it's through this, GIS world or a series of other avenues, helps to make it meaningful. And the value of GIS was that we could translate it into visuals that made it easier for agency people to know that there was a lot more behind it, rather than trying to find subtle ways to talk about, as Eirik will say, talk about things that you're not supposed to talk about with people that aren't supposed to know about places that nobody's supposed to know. And
I used to say when I was the THPO at Grand Ronde, every day I break our cultural taboos because I tell people about places that they're not supposed to be about, and it's part of the reality, right, of cultural resource management, is dealing with secret information that is often compartmentalized into communities and having to share components of it out to the general public in a way that doesn't provide the broader context of the meaning. And so it gets misinterpreted, misconstrued. It can be devalued as part of that process. And the tribe having holistic control over all of the information allowed us a better, at the time, control over what we wanted to share. And not only that, but to help shape the voice of how our partners were defining us in that process.
And I want to come back to a little bit that, and maybe now's a reasonable time, that you've seen how one approach, very technologically, heavy, has played out. It doesn't need to look that way. It doesn't need to be in that platform. What's important is we found was the opportunity to bring the information together and look at really how that ripple effect played out. This was great. We met our objectives here, but from the internal community 10 years on, however long it's been, seeing the ripple effect has been really empowering. More importantly, it's been empowering for community. Seeing the next generation coming forward with an interest, seeing and testing or trying to find ways that we can use our cell phones. Yeah, there we go. With some of this information so that elders and youngers can go out together and reacquaint with those places and to learn and the way that place needs for stewardship. And that's been very empowering. It's been slow, but that's been honest to what and how it had to occur. We fast-tracked all of the digital part because we could, but we had to let the kind of emergent process occur over here with the other information. But it was our obligation to make sure that it was available and that there was awareness of it. And that kind of speaks to, there's availability and then there's accessibility of this sort of information. And that's both inward, but also the outward. And I think that if there's really kind of a key element in this to consider, I would suggest look at that. How accessible do you want it? But how available is the information to you? Or what sort of gates do you want to put on it?
Or what gates are put on by tribal members who share it with you?
Yes.
In some cases, they may relegate that it can't be used for certain types of studies or analysis. And if you're being respectful of that, that may mean that there are important considerations of data that you need to remove from, your analysis and study. And so that's another important thing to consider is, sometimes the confidentiality concerns that we may need to have. And that's something that every community is going to have to kind of address as they go along. I think one of the neat things that Brice just mentioned is the adaptability of this and a GIS platform for elders and youth, because that changes this not just from, right, again, cultural resource management has a tendency to relegate Indigenous communities into the past, and that our cultural practices are something that have been done in the past and are no longer contemporary practice. And by showing and having tribal members who are engaging in this practice and able to kind of give this feedback into cultural resource managers, it allows them to more aggressively advocate for those agencies to look at the resources that those tribal members are going there to access, and to advocate for that access if that's simply what's needed. And that's an important value in and of itself sometimes, because as we know, sometimes our places of important locations are in areas that are not easily accessible to the public, or in some places are too open to the public and not easily accessible for what our needs are. And so, working in partnership with some of those agencies to be able to contextualize that can help sometimes, and then meeting our needs, as well as the agency being respectful of that.
Kind of, again, building on that, we found much of Grand Ronde's homelands burned 2 years ago. Out of 14 million acres seeded, 1 million were burned, and much of that high intensity. So 1/14 of the land ceded by treaty were impacted by fire. And as a result, there's a lot of restoration work. We've been able to take this information and at the right moment in process, have the conversations with agencies to talk about access and what are appropriate plants for restoration, and how to diversify forest lands, and not just for access to important plants and first foods, but or other habitat for other important species, but there's fire hardening. If we can see some mosaicness, some patchiness back on the landscape as it was, as it had been managed for here, we're going to see resiliency back on the landscape as well. So that's another application out of this that I think we're able to take advantage of because we already have it here. We're able to speak to, oh, this area, you know, if you leave this alone, the seed bank will regrow and you will find a patchiness in your riparian zones here. So maybe in the future, you're not seeing the fire jump this area and take out another 50,000 acres across the valley here, which was a very real world opportunity that was missed historically. So it's having that opportunity, meeting agencies where they're at, and then helping to pour in the appropriate information in a way that's usable for that moment. And this is one that we hadn't anticipated, but we're taking full advantage of having that information available now.
Reese, could you talk a little bit about the displacement of resources from sea level rise and stuff? Because I think one of the things that really came in and shocked us when we originally did this study is our original assessment was to see if we were going to have resources affected again by offshore energy development, you know, and its intertie into the onshore energy development. And as part of it, we started doing other mapping programs, and we started looking at things like sea level rise. And then folks like Brees and our GIS folks at the time were like, I wonder if we start putting these data over each other and see what happens. And we started having these shocking revelations that some even minor levels in sea level change could have some extremely shocking effects on resources in areas like Tillamook Bay, which if you look at the maps that are on that's the biggest concentration of blue and yellow and red and purples, right dead smack kind of in the middle of those four maps. That bay, all of those resources are going to be displaced. And so now the question becomes, where do they go? Are they going to move upland? Are they going to disappear? And how do we as a community address that and make sure that our community has access to those resources if we know that the environment that they currently grow in has the potential to disappear in the next 50 to 100 years?
Yeah, and that dovetails with Brad's observation here in the chat. And you're absolutely right. These are creating a false understanding, or rather, it's reinforcing a false understanding or limited understanding, if I more.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the studies, we talk about the paleo landscape, and there's some conjecture on the part of the tribe that the reason that South Wind's journey ends where it does is because there was a landform that projected out from there into the Pacific Ocean that would have blocked southward blowing winds from going any further. And so that paleo landscape is memorialized into our oral traditions as the place where South Wind went to retire to go to the ocean.
And so to your kind of observation, Brad, yes, we have actually. We've worked with bathymetric data available from BOEM. We've been partnering with local academics who are doing a lot of that research. They're looking at it from a very terrestrial archaeological approach. We're bringing in to the same landscape using the same base layer, if you will, of landforms, and drawing back, accounting for isostatic rebound in this area, which actually is very cool, and identifying that there are locations, and I'll use Neocani, the mountain that Eric referenced earlier. Neocani today doesn't quite conform to the rest of that narrative. The next part is that south wind goes down and gets sea otter. Below Neocani today is not sea otter habitat. It's too soft, it's too sandy, there's no hard bottom. If we draw the landscape or draw the water level down, isostatic rebound accounted for, there are some very cool landforms out there. They're very hard bottom, rocky landscapes with spires and high elevation spires that would have stood or become islands for a while before finally being submerged.
I think there's a tendency sometimes by Western science to take the economy, our creation stories, and because of the fact that they have fantastical elements to them, throw them out baby in the bathwater, and not look at them as a potential narrative of how a community has maintained its connection in the landscape, and mythologize some of these moments in ways that are harder to understand for people that are not embedded in the culture. A good example of that is in the Willamette Valley itself. We have stories that were recorded in the 1920s by Melville Jacobs from several tribal elders talking about Stone Boy and people running from a flood and up Mary's Peak. And while that myth stories rebound about the flood around the world, the difference is that about 40 years later, they realized that the Missoula floods backed up into the Willamette Falls. And so our oral traditions were talking about a practice 40 years recorded by anthropologists before geologists even accepted it as part of the academic conversation. And so I'm not saying that I will say it, we knew it before everybody else because we saw it. Our stories told us. And so, the ability for, I think, the scientific and Western world to work with tribal communities to see how these important places are tied in and how we can work to protect them, right? Because ultimately, there's going to be more people and there's not going to be any more land. And so to protect places, we have to identify them and we have to contextualize them, both for the communities that are affected and for the general public that may be affecting that place. So it unfortunately, that puts the burden on tribal communities. But for federal agencies, finding funding opportunities for these kinds of studies will empower your tribal partners to be able to be fully at the table and engaging in the process in a meaningful manner.
Yeah, and that kind of going back to your question, Eirik, about example of coastal sea level rise. Again, an application to this is now trying to work with local land management agencies to address some of this in an appropriate manner, which is, let's take Juncus. It's a basketry material. It really is wetland, wet soil environment with high drainage. As we're seeing, I'll use Tillamook Basin, seeing the inundation of salt as the sea level is coming up, that's reducing the habitat. This is a plant that wants high quality non-saline, but there are emerging colonies of this that are salt resistant, saltwater resilient. So we've suggested, with permission of basketry, those that have been managing for basketry resources, hey, agency, this is a reality. Why don't you start working with some of our basketry community to start propagating those salt resilient colonies of the plant? Let the basketry professionals manage it for the qualities, the abundance and quality that is necessary. But you handle getting the transplant and relocation to appropriate places. Basket makers know where those are. They know how to manage. They know what the qualities are. So here's a moment of using this information, identifying that it's a significant connection and use in this area now, getting in front of this and helping identify, working with botanists from the agency to say, oh, actually, these this colony of Juncus is doing really well with salt saturated soil or water. Let's get those moved. How well can we get those established in anticipation of mature managed areas 2 decades from now, so that they've taken hold. So we're anticipatory projection.
Traditional foods and basketry are not a flash pan management technique. And I think this is one of the things that sometimes gets lost. And this kind of traditional ecological knowledge can in some cases be secondary nature for tribal communities, but to share it with the agencies in a contextualized manner is hard. Oak trees, 25 years of management in order to get them to produce acorns at all, 50 years, right, before they start to produce enough to feed a person, and 75 before they produce enough to feed a family of 3, which is 3 generations of interaction with one tree, pruning it and managing it and maintaining it before you can get a return on your investment. And that means when folks were looking at large scale management of oak trees, it wasn't like let's just go manage oaks today. It was our lives wrapped up in the lifespan of how these trees and us have a relationship. And it's cyclical, and it requires that responsibility to be back and forth and to dance and sing with each other and to have that ongoing continued relationship. So for agents at the federal level to get that understanding and to work with their tribal partners to work on that day-to-day management, to be able to maintain those relationships, whether it's for a subsistence activity or for a ceremonial purpose, is kind of, not the point. The point is the ongoing continued relationship that needs to be maintained. And so, for the communities, again, this is all secondary stuff, but finding ways to relay it out to the public so that they can meaningfully change their management techniques to adapt to the needs of the community. And again, the TCL is about trying to look at it in a holistic concept, right? Because culture, plants, animals, and place are all intermingled. You can't differentiate one from the other. And so there are places where there's just a vast amount of intimate knowledge. And then there are locations where there's a much more effuse level of knowledge because people didn't interact with that place quite as much. And so there can be, everything is important, but some places just become lightning rods. And this allows tribes to get a good inventory of their own resources of concern, get an understanding of how they lay out in the landscape, and then to see how things may change in the near future. And as agencies propose things, it will allow those tribes to meaningfully bring that data back to bear to consult and to give the agents feedback on what can be done to adapt that project. So I believe we're getting very close to a break. Am I right in that, Val?
Yep.
Okay.
So we are going to take a break in about 4 minutes. We're planning to take a 10-minute break. So you can do what you need to do, get some refreshment, stretch your legs, and then come back and have some time for questions and answers and audience participant discussion of what we've been talking about in the interest of helping us put together the part 2 of this workshop so that it is as useful to you all as possible. And I had a couple of questions before we do that for you guys. So to Brad's question, is adding a time element to maps something that you've talked about or done?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, we didn't in the past because the past informs the present, and the present is a practice of the past. And so for tribal communities, understanding how the landscape levels changed is important, but the stories and places of importance don't change. The resources of importance don't change. If the landscape levels change, the resources may relocate slightly, but those places of importance that are part of their economy, that community's origin, don't change. So the past and the present can't be separated and looked at as differentiated things. They have to be, and again, the community has to be the one to also define this, because there may be needs of the community that need to be discussed in a historical context, not talking about contemporary practice or vice versa. So, I mean, it's very individualized, but when we put this data together in the original, our idea was that culture is not, you cannot separate the past and the present. It is all simply a continuation of what is. It's our culture. And so we didn't create those time breaks in that because we didn't see it as a differentiation. And the information that we got from the elders in the community kind of pointed to not do that. At one point, there was a discussion about trying to create like these timelines, and everybody was like, why? It is what it is.
I will say we did for one, there was a project and it was rather extensive, and the proponent, so anecdote here, was trying to say, well, that's all old stuff. It doesn't really matter. And in that moment, we actually did go back for a small portion of it, and we added a time element. And that was a mistake on, don't make us have to do your job for you. So we did that. We did put in a time element, and in doing that, everything that we had been saying anecdotally got hammered home in a very painful way. The project pretty much had to go, oh, yeah, no, you're right. Our bad. Clearly, this is an ongoing action and with no break. And that was very significant. But it was a necessity to bring the point home. But Erik's point of, we really felt it important to say all information is information, and it doesn't
and time's
matter.
a tool, right? Time can be used as a weapon as well. And so time and the differentiation between different technological uses in the archaeological record, or the inference of an anthropologist or archaeologist about different population movements, may differ from a tribal community. Again, we're talking about the importance of a tribe or community being able to define itself as part of this process. So that means they get to define what is their history and whether its connection is important and valid in like a narrative where it needs to be broken down into timeframes, or something that shows a continuation of use like Grand Ronde shows. And I think that's where the adaptability of this has to be open, is so that those communities can choose to adapt it to the needs that they have, and can further refine it for who their consulting parties are and their needs potentially, if they choose to do so.
Completely.
Great, thanks. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back at 2:10 Eastern, 11:10 Pacific. I'm going to share my screen and actually put up the template that is the subject of this. You've seen it a couple of times in the presentation, but I'm going to put it up for your enjoyment during the break. And then we're going to come back, and I want to help guide the discussion around the topic of implementation, for one thing, which relates to tribal capacity, obviously, but also to normalizing this way of doing business when it's not codified in a way that's that's mandated per se. And then, as I mentioned, I want we really want some feedback from folks who plan to take the part 2 of the workshop. I hope you've been able to start thinking about ways that you might put this into practice yourself, and bring some questions for Eirik and Brees while we've got them today, and help us structure the next part so that it can be maximally useful to you. So we're going to take a break, come back in 10 minutes.
Hey ya ere ay ya ra hey ho eh. Hey ya ere ay ya ra hey oh eh. Hey ya ere ay ya ra hey ha oh eh. Hey ya ere ay ya ra hey oh eh. Ay oh hey. I hope you know I never wanna see you go. I hope you know know you've always been the one. I hope you know I'll never break your heart in two. I hope you know there's no one else like you. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, yeah, 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 hey, oh, hey, hey, yeah, hey,
Hey, Eric.
Made it back.
Naturally, my neighbors are having a tree cut down today. Hopefully the background noise is not too much.
Well, I haven't heard anything so far, so
Okay, good.
people are complimenting your playlist. You might need to share the list of artists.
Sure. Let's see here. Send the link.
No, one of them was hallucination.
It is copy. It's our trusty NATHPO conference playlist. Okay, giving some folks a few minutes to come back from break here.
Yeah, that's a good.
Just reading your comment, Brad. Boundary.
Yeah, that's something I think that we can talk about. We tried to not limit the study when we originally did it to be defined by a predetermined boundary. A lot of times what we found is that people would give us an APE, or we would use a described ethnographic area of a given group that was part of our own tribe, and it was limiting. It didn't really encompass the interaction with our neighbors or in between the tribes that were even part of our confederation. And so by getting rid of the boundary and just allowing practice to dictate where people were in a landscape, it kind of changed the perspective from one of an ethnographic landscape to a tribal cultural landscape. The definition changed because this is the landscape that we use. It's modified and changed over time because the land's changed, the management of it has changed, but there are certain indelible aspects of our use that continue no matter what. And being able to describe what those are and how we've adapted to those changes or even developed management techniques is kind of, I think, the bigger thing about the TCL, because it's an inclusion not just of like archaeological and ethnographic data, but of like landscape management, individual plant gathering techniques. And so it allows the tribe in some cases to help convey information down to next generations that in some cases were prohibited. So in the case of Grand Ronde, again, because we were a terminated and restored tribe, there's some tribal members that have never done traditional activities. And so giving them that unique opportunity, whether it's something as simple as a subsistence or gathering technique, moves it from being a daily activity of subsistence to something of a ceremonial importance to them. And even more so if you can partner it with those pivotal moments in their life, like when a girl goes and gets her first root and has her first root ceremony, and so being able to help people to engage in understanding that, and people who haven't been able to in our own community, was useful, as well as getting to understand how that was placing us in the landscape more thoroughly. We are really hoping to get some back and forth. So if anyone wants to chime in, please, because part of what we want to do is in the next case or the next class, we're going to go into far more details about the types of information that Grand Ronde accessed, how we organize the data, kind of get into the weeds on that. And we also want to give opportunities to kind of like help communities during that, kind of figure out what they need to engage and where they know stuff is or isn't, and to identify resources that might be available to them that they were not aware of, that want to engage in this kind of a process. So it's one of these things that builds on itself. So the more that you participate, I think the more that all of us will get out of it.
Ooh, I love that, Eric. That's true. So, hey, Reese, you're back. Okay. I had a question for you that I'm going to preface by talking about THPO capacity, which is my shtick, right? It's our biggest area of advocacy here at NATHPO. And just to put some numbers out there, out of 574 federally recognized tribes, 208 currently have a tribal historic preservation officer. The Park Service is reviewing 9 applications for next year. And we just ran a workshop a month or 2 ago, helping 9 more tribes go through that application process to get a draft done. So that's about the average number of new THPOs that come online each year. The congressionally appropriated amount of funding for all of the tribal historic preservation officers does not increase commensurately to keep up with the growing number of THPOs. So once it gets subdivided more ways each year, then the result is level funding at best over time. And actually the average amount of funding that each THPO receives in the current year is less than it was originally in 1998 when there were 12 THPOs, which is the first year that they received that funding under the Historic Preservation Fund. So that's something that we work hard every year to change and will continue to do. And this year we're adding a new element to that. There's a bill that's been introduced by Congresswoman Ledger-Fernandez in the House and passed in the House actually, that we're working on getting introduced and passed in the Senate. That would increase the amount of the Historic Preservation Fund. And also we're hoping to have a set aside for THPOs out of that to help with that issue. And then we continue to try to tackle that on the cycle of the annual federal budget. In the meantime, that average amount is determined by a formula that the Park Service uses, which considers the land area that THPOs assume their list of duties from the state historic preservation officers on. So the mathematical average is actually around $77,000 for the current fiscal year, which is almost one whole staff person. So if you've ever sent a consultation or a review request and not gotten a response, that could be part of the reason why. Most THPOs get thousands of them every year. And in the cases of smaller THPO offices, that's the only funding they have. They're just not physically able to respond to all of those review requests. So we are keenly aware that adding this into the mix, what we're talking about doing here, can indeed entail additional capacity. So we had talked about that and when we left off of the project in the first place, it wasn't part of the scope. We were trying to outline the model and that's what we did. But now in talking about it, I think there's already been some suggestions here. Using this as a model could be leveraged into applying for grant opportunities, which I also am keenly aware takes its own capacity and time to be able to do, but also into agency requests. And so for the non-tribal and the agency participants on, I encourage you to think about ways that you may be able to make funding available for tribes to use this model to do what we've been talking about here. Because it takes people and it takes time and not just the know-how. So that's a big part of it. And Brees, I was wondering if you could talk about ways that you have already leveraged.
Yeah, so before Brees jumps in on that, we did get a question from Larry about this being a 110. To make it clear, this case study, the original one that was done as part of a kind of like an exploratory study. So it wasn't done as part of a 110 or 106 action. And the reason I brought up it should be looked at as part of a 110 process is under the 106 process, federal agencies are required to do an inventory and to make a reasonable effort to identify historic properties of cultural and religious significance to tribes and NHOs under 36 CFR 800.2 CBII. With that in mind, that's an unfunded mandate for these tribes. And with what Val just said about funding and capacity issues, how is a tribe supposed to make a meaningful comment back when they don't have the funding to do so and you're not providing it? You get funding to do the inventory as part of a 106 process, yet our tribal partners are not provided the same funding level. And yet they're expected to have the same level of capacity to respond. And so if agencies start to look at the TCL as part of a 110 process and to begin find funding avenues, then the funding can be given to tribes so that they can do this inventory. And that means if there is a 106 action, they can meaningfully come to the table because I've identified their resources of importance. So I think that's where I want to make that clear for Larry. And with that in mind, I would love to hear, Brees, how you've leveraged to get capacity, because it is an ongoing issue.
I have to start by saying there is, Grand Ronde leadership invest a lot in its cultural resources department, and specifically its historic preservation office. I can't say enough about what that support is. Without that support, we wouldn't have been supported in pursuing the initial concept, let alone the subsequent steps. So, and not everybody has that start point. So I do want to recognize that. And so what we have done to leverage from this, though, was first the demonstration that there was value in this when we went to leadership, and that there could be these potentials. That brought forward support from leadership and going forward. We, in hindsight, we ate a lot of cost in the first round, if I'm honest. Probably about 5 to 1 we ate, if I was honest to it. And everybody should be paid a living wage, and therefore, we ate a lot. And so that we were honest to what that could be. And we succeeded with volunteers, unpaid interns, using different resources within the tribe to capitalize on this, research and data entry and those elements. Lessons learned from that played out in the 2.0 version. We asked for a whole lot more money, and we asked for longer time. There were limits in that, but it was a commensurate amount of cost, and I believe the product is viable for what it is, for what that amount was. The importance in that was we were able to bring on basically two full-time staff, a contractor, and a support who did a lot of the translation and transcription of language on this second round. Round one gave us the insight that to do this correctly would require that. We were hampered by those fires that I mentioned, and then subsequent flooding and an ice storm, and COVID popped its head in. We were just short the murder hornets getting in the way of doing that work. But we were able to still succeed in having people out on the ground doing the field work, as well as back in the offices, bringing that information together. Valerie's point about, for those not familiar with what tribes THPOs workloads are, last year we had 8,000 engagements within those 14 million acres that I mentioned. Those are state and federal. We work with 67 state and federal agencies combined. So that is a lot now, and we kept up with that. So we knew that we could not handle this work internally. So we scheduled the contract to bring in enough money to cover that dedicated time by others. Now, we now have 2 permanent staff as a result of that. We were able to demonstrate that, they were self-funded in essence, and that carried forward. And it kind of begets, doing that work begets more work, which is a cautionary tale. Sometimes you get more than you want. So to the capacity that's what we could do. But I also know other communities that are doing this with themselves and the culture committee or other volunteer groups. And it's that going back to the conceptualization, being very reflective of what the resources are and how can you bring those in as it relates to your own capacity, and being comfortable in empowering others to bring this information together. And everybody's community has their own structure. And I cannot bring that point home enough. And that's my caution to you agency reps that may be sitting in. Don't please take this as a model and go into a community and go, well, those guys are doing it. Do not do that. That is inappropriate. And it is, unless you're prepared to provide the support to bring it to that, you're just setting up, false expectations. Now, I put it back to you agencies. You actually have a lot of mechanisms within your structure to partner through different capacities or different avenues in their government agency agreements, programmatic agreements, government to government agreements that can move funds into the appropriate place to bring that capacity back up as it relates to a given project. One of the necessities here is time. This is not a short time project. It really does take a lot of time to get the structure right, go through that a couple of times, beta test, how well is it going to work? And that's if you're in the digital world. If you're just doing writing and using spreadsheets, you still have to kind of go through and go, oh, if only I'd had this category of information. The cost of 3 extra seconds of inputting, would have saved me 5 hours on the back end. So really putting investment into the internal structure of this. There are mechanisms, and I think 106 people tend to get a little locked into that. What we're not touching on that much right now is the relevance of NEPA, where we have a social justice component that this actually fits very well with. This is empowerment. It's a recognition of sovereignty and what a sovereign, opportunity or responsibility to talk about can be brought forward in that way. And therefore there could be offset funds or contracts to a tribe to achieve this, or ethnographic studies, which becomes a very broad overarching heading that doesn't say how that needs to be written or captured. This is really just a mechanism for getting a lot of good information in one place. So capacity in many ways can be defined by each community. Did I leave anything out, Eric?
Thanks, Bruce. I'd love to hear your take on Alan's question in the chat box here. This is such an important question.
Every tribal community has been dislocated from its ancestral lands. The degree of time and space is different for every community. Grand Ronde was affected by forced removals and relocations to the reservation, some of which is, I would argue, still ongoing. For us, we actually found that there were 2 or 3 venues that were the best to get this information. One was, in some cases, the earliest ethnographic journals done by salvage ethnographers coming and interacting with our community and interviewing elders talking about life prior to the reservation. In this case, it would give place names, direct practices, long-term familial connections that, because we know our family trees, all of a sudden you start realizing who's related to who and, how interrelated some of the families are. The other thing that we found is that surprising to me was early settler journals in local historical societies. Not very publicly available, but they would be locally published by the Historical Society and talk about these local interactions with tribal folks that were relocated to our reservation at that early point. And it was beautiful to see because they were mostly peaceful and beneficial to both sides, at least given the context of the time frame. And the other one I think that was the most undervalued that I came to appreciate was the continuity of the oral tradition inside of the community and how much people remembered. I think, again, there's a tendency by those of us who are trained to be archaeologists to think about the past being relegated to the past and not the present to be a continuation of past practice. And for Indigenous communities, it's the latter, not the former. And so there's not a differentiation. And so remembering that that practice is as important as it was in the past as it is today. And it may have adapted because the technology has changed, but the intent and purpose is not really all that much different. And so the practice can change in its importance, but it's still important. So the early ethnographic and historical record and oral traditions were the ones that we used the most significantly. Having said that, there are a lot of other resources that could be potentially available, but I think local historical societies might have a lot of hidden gems that get overlooked.
Absolutely. And I think every community has awareness of kind of those start points or, where the launch pad is for some of that, and it just starts growing from there. And one thing that we found is we then were able to be suspect of other sources. We could start to see patterns of kind of manipulated narrative by, agents here. And again, it's one of the secondary results out of this is being able to see a pattern and that only is emergent of having all of the pieces together side by side. I think every community has their, let me rephrase this. I think this is an opportunity for every community to demonstrate or bring home the point of how disjointed their and disarticulated some communities may be from their places of the past, but that doesn't mean that they don't have that connection to the place that they are. And that sometimes is a difficult moment for agencies. I know that, for Grand
I would
Ronde,
argue that sometimes the inability for a community to access an important location may make it more important because its inability to be accessed as part of its ongoing continued cultural practice makes it kind of burn like a bright ember. And so by agencies not allowing access, in some cases, they could almost take something that's sacred and move it up in a category of like, dangerously sacred because no one can go up there anymore. At the same time, very sacred places have become access to the general public, can lose their value because there's an inability to have them private. So, there's a juxtaposition on both sides with that as well.
and I have had conversations with other communities that have said, just in conversation of, hey, we used to be over in this area. We were forced 500, 1,000 miles away. And all along the way is our point of connection, as well as where we were and now where we have been, and we kind of kick around ideas and, seeing that pattern in that breadth of connection then has a lot of value, that you're able to say, well, no, we've been removed and forced from those actions, but the actions were necessary. So those actions have continued throughout this area and all along the way. For those tribes that comprise Grand Ronde, for instance, being removed to a reservation down in the south, and then suddenly being forcibly removed from that reservation back to another reservation 300 miles away, those actions that were necessary for stewardship in all of its manners are now spread across all of that land. And it's really important, I believe, to bring that understanding to agencies. If agencies are positioned to be holders of trust responsibility, they need to have that awareness for two reasons. One, if they don't have it, it's harder to make them accountable to it. The second is, once you've made them aware of it, now they have to be accountable. Just document and document and document.
And it's such a perfect illustration of the gap that exists in the system, right? With the formula I was talking about that's used to determine the apportionment that each.
Well, and that's for tribes with established THPOs. So a
And
tribe
that's
that
for
doesn't have
tribes with
so
a
if a
Park
tribe
Service
doesn't-
approved THPO, right? A Park
so a
Service
tribe that
approved THPO
doesn't-
that have gone through that application process successfully. But then the funding that's administered as that non-competitive grant is based on current land area. It's not based on ancestral land at all. And so the THPO is the final say, is the signatory for actions on that defined land, but is able also to be the go-to person for reviews and consultation on all the rest of it. But there's no funding. They can't use. There's no funding provided for that, and so
it's supplemental funding
that's
from
sort
the
of
tribal government, often from gaming, if the tribe has that, or other economic enterprises, and it's never sufficient for the amount of land mass. And it's not just federal agencies that they're interacting with, it's state and local in addition, as well as the tribal membership's concerns. So it's kind of a multifaceted thing that tribes have to deal with. And I don't think sometimes as agencies, we get our own inundation, too much work, not enough funding for the mandate that we have. But that same issue is compounded in tribal communities. And then we have an expectation that we can get them to come to the table in a meaningful manner. And I think we need to rephrase this and find how can we equalize this footing so that they can become that meaningful partner in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And things like the TCL and looking at it as part of an inventory process up front overall for long-term planning enable some funding to get to these communities so that they can do these studies, analyze all of the resources that could be affected, and then categorize that in a way that's culturally meaningful and find ways to convey that back to the agency when they have actions that might be proposed.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is using all of the available data that the tribe decides to use and filters. So if they find things that are maybe from a disreputable source or are clearly contain racist connotations, it may not be valuable to include that data in your compilation. At the same time, maybe it is because it's such a unique outlier or such a norm, that you need to show it at the time frame of like, hey, you got to keep in mind that the historical record is muted because everybody says this during this time. So we're going to tell you based on oral tradition, this is what, right? In some cases, that's what needs to be done because of the dehumanization from that early colonial effort. And so again, it's about giving tribal communities opportunity to become meaningful consulting partners as part of the NEPA or NHPA process. But to do that, they have to have funding to do the inventory so that they can meaningfully organize the data to come back and have that consultation. But ultimately, they have to own it and they have to determine how it's used. And that's the biggest crux of this. And finding ways for agencies to partner and enable their tribal communities to become engaged in this process, but without dictating it to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it may not be appropriate for some communities. They may have capacity issues. It may philosophically not blend well with their leadership style at their community, or they may have other concerns that we're not aware of that just make it not a feasible process. And they may choose to adapt the methodology that was more in line with what McCaw or Yurok did, or even take a fourth path of something that hasn't been fully identified yet. We just wanted to elucidate the process that Grand Ronde used. And part of the reason we used it is because it's the ability to use that overwhelming data, and not just data that we've put together, but data that others have used together, because it all kind of coincided and reinforced each other. And what we found is that early historians and ethnographers wrote down the same things that our elders are telling us today. And so it kind of created this compounding effect where we could use a volume of voice to say, hey, we've been telling you this for 20 years and you won't listen to us, but your guys have been writing it for 120 years. So let's listen to them at least. And then that voice became hard for them to kind of discontinue its validity. And I got to say, it was sad at the same time that we had to utilize this tool, but it was valuable in the fact that now the tribe, when it comes and talks about things, people know that they feel more secure in the fact that the tribe is secure in its own knowledge. I wish that could have started from the beginning of many of those relationships. And I think that that's a need for us agencies to work on developing that with our partners. But ultimately, the way we chose to deal with it at Grand Ronde was in an aggressive way, and to get everything we could and to use it to leverage voice and to claim our stake in a landscape and own our own history. And that was really that simple.
And so the second part of implementation, I'd like to be sure and talk about while we have our agency partners here with us today, is just that, is normalizing this process. And our lawyer, Wes, is back on with this. I see in the list of participants. I happened to have a call with him last week after we had our planning meeting, and he called that out again. What we're talking about is additions to existing processes. It's not in statute, it's not in regulation, it's not in policy. How do we get it done? How do we get traction on it in the face of, we hear from so many different directions still continuing direct opposition to acknowledging the validity of traditional knowledge right in people's faces. I'm hearing that in other meetings I'm in about other projects, and it just is like, how are we still here, for one thing? And
it becomes
so, Wes,
a recurrent conversation.
I don't want to call you out, but I just want to take a moment and highlight that as a discussion point today. How do we normalize this? And this is one topic. It's the impetus behind our Sacred Places Summit, for one thing, which put a pin in September 21st and 22nd. We're going to be going virtual again this year, but on the fall equinox, we're going to be having that annual event again, looking at the current legal and policy framework of protecting Native places and what the gaps are and what may be possible to start closing those gaps. And it's all related to this, right? There's nothing in this model that's disallowed, from agency folk. There's nothing that agency folks can't do that's been laid out here. And so how do we come from the top down and look at what changes need to be made to better enable to either make these mandates or to enable support for doing things the right way, which is really just what we're talking about, doing things the way that they need to be done from a point of our moral obligation, right? But also from a grassroots level, how do we normalize this approach so that everybody's doing it? And if need be, we can push it up into policy. That's and close the gap in that way from the top and the bottom at the same
time. I think that's what you're doing with this, right? And by this first whole kind of toolkit presentation being done with both agency and tribal partners is the ability to start this conversation, right? Take the two-tiered communication approach. And so, I think this is where we start the conversation of saying there's a new way of doing things. And to answer the questions in the chat box, Brad, 110 is an unfunded mandate under NHPA where agencies are supposed to do a full inventory of all their resources. Unfortunately, most agencies don't have funding for this, and we have to do it under a 106 action. The idea is that by getting upfront funding and providing it to tribes, rather than the agency doing 110, the tribes doing it so that they can identify their historic properties of cultural and religious significance, regardless of whether they're within their traditional lands, their ceded lands, or their current reservation. Because the CFRs are pretty clear that once a tribe identifies a historic property of cultural and religious significance, it doesn't matter where it's at. They're part of the consulting parties. And again, I would refer people back to the reference that I made earlier with the CFRs if you're not sure of that. The reason I mentioned, and to go down to the next one with Liz and talking about the NEPA process, the reason I bring this up as part of the NEPA process is when you're doing these kinds of studies and we're talking about environmental justice and the impact of cultural resources, if you have this kind of an inventory already done, you can start to do that kind of an analysis and ask the tribal community, hey, is this going to have an effect on the resources that are important to your community? Is this landscape something that is of importance in your community? And if so, what are the contributing elements to it? And how can we change our project to minimize or mitigate the impact, right? And so I think the bigger question isn't how it fits into the NEPA process. It's about how you can find ways to get funding to fully include it in the NEPA process, because it's self-explanatory. It gives a better informed report at the end, whether you're doing an EA or an EIS, because ultimately it provides more data for the community to show the effects that it will have on them.
And to that, and maybe the way of kind of prompting that opportunity is to ask the question when the undertaking X is being brought forward. And generally, I'm speaking global statements, tribes are the last to be engaged in that process and are handed a final report or a notice that things are going forward. But the opportunity question is to ask, what information was utilized to get to this understanding? And if the tribe has awareness of other information that should have been included, then it's an opportunity to go back and say, you've made a decision with only part of the available information. You, agency or undertaker, proponent, you're not living up to the obligation. You are only partially informed in your decision making. And how can you, agency, regulator, make the decision while only being partially informed? And that brings us to the process part.
So as Brees is getting to this, I want to say, as an agent person working for an agency, it can be an uncomfortable position when we're brought a project proposal that's at 80 or 90% design and expected to push it through the compliance process because it's coming from an outside source or is a project driven by a private proponent, and it becomes a federal project by proxy. And then we don't have the ability really to go in and meaningfully say, yeah, we can change the whole scope of the project when we initiate consultation with the tribes, because somebody's already kind of shoehorned stuff in, and now we're trying to figure out how to make it fit and if it can, and pushing back both directions. And so I think being clear and open in these communications and talking about, hey, we had a project proposal come from an outside source. This is where the design's currently at. We haven't fully addressed all of our identified resource concerns, but we'd like to get yours. And if you have the TCL process identified and fully implemented, then the tribe can pull those resources, start to have that contextualized conversation. You can see where the overlay of interest is the same, and you can see where it becomes divergent and work on your communication and how the product comes out in the EA or EIS. So I think, and yes, somebody mentioned about maritime landscapes, and there was a conversation about that during the workshops. The Macaw were quite adamant about wanting it to be maritime. And I think the reason we stuck with landscape was simply because it was more inclusive of both maritime and terrestrial life, and was more inclusive to it being used in other landforms, not just in the ocean setting. So, but getting back to the other oh, go ahead, Bruce.
So just on that, we've also made the distinction that it would have been landscape previously, therefore it still fit under landscape.
Yeah, so again, the TCL process best works when it's done as part of a planning process, independent and away from NEPA or NHPA, because it allows the agency to provide funding and support to the tribal communities where they can do these full inventories. So that way, when there is a NEPA or NHPA action, they can meaningfully engage and give comment. And having said that, if you have a large planning effort, like a planning for a full park management plan, maybe it's worth talking about having additional funding identified during that process and having the tribe engage and do a TCL concurrently. So there are opportunities, I think, during large scale planning efforts that fall under the NEPA umbrella. We're looking for additional funding from agencies that could support tribes could be very beneficial.
So I'm going to share the Grand Ronde perspective that may be helpful here. I hope so. And it kind of goes to if you're an agency, when do you engage a tribe? Because that's one of these kind of outside elements that has a direct impact into the relevance of a TCL. What we have started to say, and this goes to Erik's point a little bit, is agencies need to be providing consultation opportunity to us in particular, because I'm not speaking for anybody else. When you think about asking for money, when you ask for money, when you receive the money, and when you spend the money, because this is where the TCL value may also come into play. At the point that you're thinking about money for an undertaking, that scale and scope moment, that's the opportunity that the tribe can come in and go, maybe not there. You don't need to know why. You just need to know that going forward there is heartburn zone. Maybe we need to help you understand, let's find alternatives. It's still scale and scope. The next is when that agency asks for money, it's beginning a commitment process. So hopefully it's narrowed down. Again, engagement with the tribe that may have a thorough or robust TCL element to it, or other record set, becomes the moment to check in and say, have you accounted for your cultural resources obligation in your ask? You have a line item for cultural resources. Again, here's an opportunity to say, you should probably consider asking for more money so that the tribe can invest in its TCL development to help this project and all others subsequent. When that agency receives the money, that's really commitment time. You're obligated to see this project go forward or the money goes away, right? So again, you need to be working closely with the tribe in that. And then ultimately, when you are spending the money, you are on full commitment. The undertaking is committed to. And if you have missed these other windows, that's on you. And that's when potentially there's going to be a mitigation need. And there's nothing that says mitigation needs to be based on what is commensurate mitigation for damage or harm. What are the elements being mitigated for? Is it cultural hurt, harm to the community, destruction of a place that, Coyote created and, a developer believes it's theirs to destroy? There are lots of variables. The TCL, and we've used our TCL in similar situations as I've kind of outlined. So those are just for consideration as ways of helping to support the justification of agencies to support you in developing it. So I just missed a question here.
And yes, Brad, it really comes two-part. Resource managers need to advocate for the inclusion of funding so that tribes can be part of the process. But it also requires tribes to do their own advocacy. And that's both to the agencies and to outside funding sources, and to work with organizations like NATHPO that are trying to leverage additional funding for these kinds of studies in order to equalize the relationship and consultation. The thing I always try to remember is when we talk about a meaningful and good faith effort at consultation, that means it needs to be both parties involved and having a conversation and a flow of communication both ways. In order for that to happen, both partners have to have enough information to be able to share. And agencies often are making an expectation for an unfunded response from these tribal communities about resources of importance to them, and tribes are trying to scramble and find a way to triage it. So looking at this holistically, really it takes a two-pronged approach. So yeah, I would agree with you, Brad. It requires resource managers to make the advocacy to the managers, and it requires tribes to make the advocacy to the management at agencies and to other funding partners that these kinds of studies can be valuable. If it's valuable for your community. If it's not, then by all means, don't make an advocacy that doesn't work for your community. But, you know, I think the trick is that not every community has the same level of capacity. Finding tools and methods so that everyone can equalize that relationship, so that tribes have an equal relationship and the ability to meaningfully consult, is important, because it shows a good trust relationship and it provides a meaningful opportunity for those relationships to be developed. And I think that in itself can make sure that agencies get timely and meaningful consultation, and that it doesn't impact their own projects. And over time, it will create a lessening on that overhead. But it takes time and it takes effort and it takes a lot of due diligence. And that only starts when we start to look at ways to equalize the power relationship when it comes to information. And this is one of the ways that we found that was the best to kind of close that gap, as it were. It's not a fix-all, but it did provide an opportunity for our community to kind of step in and kind of more meaningfully engage all of our other partners and to get their attention a little bit.
Yeah, and if I'm seeing in Brad's comment here, another kind of element in that 110 application here, maybe, and I'm leapfrogging a couple of steps.
So Liz Ellis's question, the only examples that I've seen for that is intergovernmental agreements between a state like Department of Transportation and a tribe. Usually it's done for monitoring or mitigative measures under 106 from what I've seen. But those are the examples that I've seen in the past.
And yeah, the ODOTs, or sorry, DOTs may be a very good opportunity to Liz's question, because of they in essence are operating as franchises of the federal government and federal highways. So there can be easier mechanisms, but that also is by experience very state dependent. But there are very good examples here with Washington and Oregon that I could point people to. And if it's because they are franchises and the federal side nexus is in support, those models should be applicable across the board. So feel free to reach out and I can help point you to some contacts on that. But that is a mechanism through very robust IGAs that you can.
You would have to be clear about what it's being used for.
Yes.
And that's part of the problem with this, right? Is the other thing is making sure that contracting officers and management understands that the data collection is being owned and maintained by the tribe, and that a redacted report or version would be provided. And then during further consultation, additional information would be provided out on an as needed basis. So it's not like, and this is important for two reasons. One, there can't be an expectation that the TCL is going to fix the tribe consultation problem, right? And I put that in quotes because it can be perceived by that way by some folks. The other thing is that this reinforces and creates a more robust consultation process. It's not meant to dissolve it. It's meant to equalize the relationship with access to information so that it can be more meaningful, not to create a situation where the agency owns the information and no longer needs the tribe to determine their interest.
Absolutely. And I was going to say that is one of those watch out points. It goes back to the empowerment statement that Eirik made and has been making. this as an approach, particularly the way that we've applied it, is to be wholly about self-empowerment. Therefore, we control the data, we control the access, we are responsible to its translation for use outward. And even that, we are guarded and regulated, self-regulated in how we approach what is shared out. It may be simply there is a map on the table, people can look at it for conversations, but that map then stays with us after the fact. Or it may simply be a printout of what the resources are within an area with no point location. It just, from that, it becomes what is the undertaking, so that then we can develop the right translation of the information so that it's applicable.
Lori Ann Velez, your question is, if you're under current contract with one of the current studies, I would really encourage you to reach out to Dana Goodson or Monique Molyneux, who is at the O'Dowd Foundation, and ask them when the study begins. I think they're starting to talk about contracting options next, and to make a presentation to the tribes that are affected in the very near future. But I would encourage you to reach out directly to them.
Yeah. It really should be understood that this is an internal development for internal purposes. Those internal purposes may be consultation. They may be any number of other things.
Everyone's gotten quiet.
Yeah, if tribes have been contracted, for instance, to provide monitoring, or if you have a monitoring program or other engagements, that may be another way of kind of developing.
The other thing is that
capacity.
if you have existing contracts that are like that, and you're wanting to organize this kind of a project, the reports that your monitors are developing, if they're developing reports, even if it's just identification of ethnographic resources of importance to the community, like plants and animals, that can start to populate this kind of a database. So if a monitor's out and is like, hey, I saw that we could gather this, this, and that, and I might go hunting this over there, all of a sudden there's 4 or 5 points of data that start to get input into your TCL, right? So this stuff is all compounded and builds on itself over time too, because culture isn't static. There was a Whitman in one of our neighboring communities. I heard him say one time, culture changes every day, but our traditions stay the same. For a long time, I didn't understand what he meant, but our traditions really haven't changed at all. But the way we express our culture has, because we have different tools and technology today, but a lot of the same things are being done. And so I think back on that. And I think, when we're doing these kinds of things, again, that continuity of past to present is not iterative. It's continuative. It builds on itself because it's a practice. It's not something that's relegated into the past. And so during the data acquisition and the georeference and conceptualization, all this, I think that's important to think about, is like, how does your community want to look at this? Do you want to create those kind of time breaks of like, this is what we used to do and this is what we do now, or this is how things are, because there may be a need to identify those changes. So that's all part of this process of the development of this. I guess, as we're kind of getting closer to the end, as folks are not asking as many questions, I want to make this clear that this is not set in stone. This is something that's being built upon. And while it's still a newer type of process, the hope is that it develops the opportunities for agencies to partner with their tribes and NHOs in a meaningful manner so that they can develop information internally and come to the consultation table ready and informed and capable of getting good information back to agencies. And I think that the ability for agencies to support that for tribes will be beneficial and self-evident. But I think tribes looking at opportunities to to organize the data, to look at their worldview and how they want to engage agencies is a meaningful process as well. And whether it looks like the TCL process as Grand Ronde developed and has continued to develop it, or it's a different iterative process, I think it's important for the communities to look at how they want to exercise control over the definition of self and how they define that into the future. And I think that this tool is one of those things that could be potentially useful. And I would encourage people to look into it and to read the case studies and to follow up with those who are with tribes to follow up on the next training that we're going to have. And for agency folks to work to reach out to their tribes, see if there's interest in something like this, see if there's something that's of interest inside of your own agency, and to look at the examples that have already been done successfully, and to maybe even reach out to the agencies who are working on this currently on the most current iterative process to see how it can be adapted into your own agency.
That's a great segue, Eric. Thanks. I pulled this back up because I wanted to ask everyone, especially folks who are planning to participate in our part 2 of our workshop, which we really hope will be a working session, sort of in keeping with our turbo THPO model, which is going through the Park Service THPO application step by step and in a guided way with expert help. We had been thinking of breaking that one into 5 breakout rooms, and Brice will bring more people from the Grand Ronde team to talk about each of these steps in a separate breakout room, the larger bubbles here. And so my question is, as you've been listening and hopefully thinking about how you may begin to apply this model within your office and on places important to you, does that sound like a helpful structure, a structure that would be useful to you to go into a breakout room and talk about an individual section of this model? Or as you've been thinking about how you might apply this, what other questions or thoughts have you come up with along the way that you would like to pose today? And then Brice and Eric, are you still thinking that that might be a useful way to structure it, or has something else come up for you while we've been talking today?
I think, what I'm also seeing in the chat, and are others have done similar or taken on similar, and maybe in those chat rooms would be an opportunity if people are comfortable in sharing some of those experiences for others to learn and from.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things that we can, and tribes need to think about, is all of the available information that's out there. As we said, Grand Ronde did kind of a big grab that in a lot of ways was overly ambitious. And we did it because I felt the need to make an overbearing presentation against other folks. Because I got tired of being told that the communication from my elders wasn't sufficient. And so, I think not every piece, if I would go back and do this, I would do it slightly different than I had done in the beginning. And I think that because each community will have a different level of capacity and means, when you engage in this process, thinking about like, what is the types of information? What is the recording process? What does the security look like? Are you going to allow there to be security? Will there be restrictions on information or not? Does your community have secret societies? Where that becomes a necessity, where it's not like everybody can have access to things. I've had the opportunity to work with some communities, even had gendered information where things couldn't be given to the other genders. And so if that's the case, maybe the information needs to be constructed in a secure way to not hurt people as well. And so I think that there's a lot of internal cultural considerations in addition to all of this that a lot of communities are going to need to wrestle with. And as we're approaching the next case, the next set of trainings, think about these things, because it's things that we really can't provide a whole lot other than a framework of the conversation, because you have to go home and have these. Liz, that's a good idea. Maybe what we can try to do is bring in Dave Ball since he was part of the original process, and talk about what the agency expectations were during some of the original and now what they're thinking about with this process. Because I think that might help folks who are working at federal agencies to get a better understanding of how other federal partners are looking at this, that are engaging with the process. And to make it clear, the agency that is making the biggest efforts in this right now is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And again, they've done this they did the case study off the West Coast. They executed another one in Hawaii. Now they're back off the West Coast doing Morrow, Humboldt Bays, and Oregon coast. I think managing the expectations of agencies is also one of the bigger things. Like we've repeated several times, the data needs to be, in order for this to be a successful type of process, the tribes have to be the definer of their own history. And that means they get to control the data. And what they choose to share is what has to be acceptable to the agency. And that negotiation may take some work so that everyone is amendable to what that product may look like. It could be some maps. It could be some heat resolution maps. It could be some descriptors. It could be a book. It's not for us to define what those deliverables look like. That's between the tribe that chooses to take on this kind of a study and the agency that's supporting it. Or if multiple agencies are involved, for them to negotiate that in good faith with the tribes. But I do think that the case studies that were done by the tribes that participated in the first study and the NHL one are valuable for people to look at, because I think they provide distinct methodologies that can be useful and adaptive to any community, depending on their needs and how much resources they can bring to bear on it. And it can show the level of support that agencies need to provide.
Yeah, you're hitting on, one of the key elements behind this is trust and confidence. And we put energy into that in both iterations of the work that we've done, in part because we wanted to just be able to hit the ground running with information from it. And so early on, we shared that A, we were doing it, and B, we shared that, here's what the data structure is. You don't get to have it, but know that when we are having a conversation, and if we make reference to this, this is it. It is a robust system. And, that I believe helped with kind of that stage setting, so that when it came to application and the conversations, et cetera, we had that at the ready. There was already awareness of, oh yeah, they're coming in, they know, they really are their own experts. We need to get behind that concept. And this is how Grand Ronde is choosing to demonstrate their own expertise of self.
I know I'm not there anymore, but when I was there, one of the things that I also found valuable is non-tribal members who engaged in the process of helping develop the data often developed a greater appreciation, and almost every single one of them ended up moving into CRM work at some level, shape, fashion, or form. And because of that, our attempt to educate them has changed the way that they interact with tribal communities. And I think in some ways that might be the more valuable process that Grand Ronde got out of the TCL process, was the ability to help train people that were going to become the professionals of tomorrow on a better methodology and method of inclusion, because they were doing community-based participatory research at the request of the community. And I think that may be an undersold aspect, is the professional development that can come out of this, both for the folks that are participating in it, as well as for the tribe that exercises this kind of a project.
So rather than trained archaeologists who had tangential mentions of working with tribes and their education, learning about it the hard way on the job, you were having people work with you and then go into anthropology, archaeology.
We would regularly reach out to the local universities and ask them if they had any people who were looking for internships, and that we had unpaid internship opportunities. And a lot of it was data monkey crunching stuff, but inevitably every single opportunity resulted in additional folks getting educational opportunities. And in some cases later on, coming back to be involved with like archaeological field schools that the tribes worked with through the University of Washington that are on the reservation. So I think these they build on themselves and on each other, right? And as you develop these skills and techniques about, and it's not just about data collection and management, right? Because at its biggest form, it feels like that. But the reality is that this is about developing relationships with communities. And so people who were not part of the community who engaged in that got a better understanding of the ability to interact with tribal members in their own setting and in their home so that they could more meaningfully engage them, I think, professionally later on. And I think that was, in my opinion, the biggest benefit that we got out of the whole process. But, you know, that's one of those things that you don't see until 10, 15 years down the road, you know.
Absolutely. And it's that ripple effect that is everywhere. Those undergrads, and I mentioned the work that Gabe did with kind of noticing the role of whale. And he now is faculty at a university, and he is talking about sending his students our way. And he is looking to, and does, I've been following his work, and he brings all of that concept forward in everything that he teaches, everything that he's basically evaluating his students on. And there's real value in that. It's not just meeting the immediate need, but it's how do we get 3 degrees of change so that 5, 10, 15 years from now, we have permanent change, not change that's based on personality. And that's really, truly rooted. And you're hearing how we've done it. I think every community recognizes that and pursues that in their own way. And I think, I saw Brad's comment here in the chat that, yes, I think this would be an amazing element brought into tribal college and university curriculum through geography, the THPO, the cultural resources. It is just a central point that can be weighted to any one element. Internally, we used to talk here, things would be structured in a very hierarchical way. But the reality is that the world works to people's strengths. And this TCL can be the same thing. It can be weighted towards a place. It can be weighted towards people or practice. And it really requires all of that information being in one place so that you can draw from that as necessary. So if anybody's interested in developing the curriculum for that, I think that would be amazing.
I'd be more ready to help.
So we got a couple of comments indicating that if we structured the second workshop this way, it would be useful to folks. So it sounds like we'll stay on target with that for now. Are there buckets of topics that are not covered here that you, as you've been listening, have been thinking, would need to be incorporated for your community or your use of this model? Have you done something similar? Have you undertaken something similar on your own, completely separate from this, that you would like to share something about your experiences with us here or in the next workshop? We have some time left, so I'm trying to stimulate discussion and questions here while we've got everyone.
Please, this is the opportunity.
Yes, please unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, I'd love to ask a question. So my name's Liz Ellis, and I'm the Cultural Resources Review Coordinator. I handle delegated federal funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I worked on a project where we funded a TCL study for a federal tribe here in Washington State. The goal of the study was to address a very large watershed so that by doing the study, we could get a better idea of what future cultural resource compliance would look like. In other words, the information gathered by the tribe would give us a sense of whether certain areas would continue to require a survey, just to monitor, or whether we could have an inadvertent discovery plan in place. And we were under the impression that by getting a better understanding of the area, this large watershed, through doing this study, actually it was a two-part study, ethnographic background as well as a TCP, perhaps we would be able to do fewer cultural resource investigations. But it turned out that that wasn't quite the case. And it was quite, as you know, it was quite expensive. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, because as you know, these studies are very expensive. And I was wondering if you could speak to how do you sell the agencies on the benefits of funding such a study, especially if they continue to result in just further surveys? And I understand why they resulted in further surveys, because it turned out that the result from the oral history and the ethnographic study turned out that this watershed was of vital importance and remained extremely sensitive. And so just could you speak to that?
Unfortunately, I guess doing condition assessments, right, which is different. Monitoring is different than doing additional surveys. If it's condition assessment and monitoring after an initial study, that's something that the agency should be doing as part of its normal perform process. It's part of our responsibility to maintain and identify resources and if they're being affected. Are we funded appropriately for it? Unfortunately, never. So that means we often have to do rolling surveys or condition assessments, or in some cases, it's a triage issue. If you have an opportunity where the agency has sufficient funding and can either do those kinds of condition assessments or monitoring internally or provide it out to the tribe to do as a contracted service, that's just part of a normal agency responsibility. Now, if you have a different undertaking and additional studies need to be done, another TCP study, I think the question I would ask is it the same APE and is it the same TCP, or is it a different contributing element to the same TCP that's being affected, and is there a need for study for it? So that's a more nuanced question and would probably be something that like the cultural resource manager would need to talk with the tribe and the SHPO about, and the THPO, because it's very dependent on the context that you're sitting in. So I guess I would pose that back in two different ways. As an agency, we have a responsibility to maintain and monitor. So that's a non sequitur. If we have a new undertaking, 106 says we have to do a new inventory. If we've done the inventory and it's to the same condition, then or within a reasonable time frame where it doesn't need to be done, then we need to justify why so, and justify to the tribes why they shouldn't be paid to do so again as well.
I'm going to approach it from a different angle. And I would start, and this is my kind of analyst hat on, data analyst. And I think one of the hurdles may have been an assumption of the expectations, that by doing this study that you would be able to do less. And that may be any number of reasons why there would be an expectation of that. But if you ever have the expectation, and this is just right data crunching, of it going one way, you have to always allow the expectation that it may also increase your obligations. One of my biggest pet peeves is the pedestrian surveys done while looking up. And of course you found no archaeology. If the intent is to go find and identify, then that is what the intent is. And I think the TCL approach is about identifying resources. Once identified, then it becomes that obligation element that the agencies, whomever, have to them. And it's at that point that the conversation about avoid, minimize, mitigate can occur. And I think, you know, setting up expectations of trying to do less may be where there could have gone a different way. I think the other side of that is now you probably have a better idea, and all parties have a shared common understanding of the full breadth and depth of what those responsibilities are in an area, and that there may have been a lot missed historically. And it's how do you then apply that going forward? So that may not be what you were hoping for in an answer. And I'm happy for a follow-up if you want.
Yeah, and I would agree, Liz, without knowing what was found and having a copy of the report and the conversations, it's really hard to kind of comment third party on some of these. You know, what I would say is that going back and redoing physical field work isn't always necessary unless there is a reasonable assumption that the conditions have changed out there. If the tribe's making the argument that climate change or a recent management technique has changed and needs and requires a new survey, it makes sense. But if there isn't one of those mitigating factors, it may be a conversation that needs to be had. Yeah, reasonable and good faith effort. So this is one of my mantra points that I go off on more than a few times with my fellow agency folks, as well as folks at tribes, about what is a reasonable and good faith effort, whether it's in the identification of a tribe or NHO, or whether it's in the consultation process. I try to use Webster's dictionary as much as I can, and they describe consultation as an ongoing and meaningful dialogue. A dialogue indicates that there's two parties at least or more, and that there's two-way communication, which means that for consultation to be fulfilled, the agency not only needs to reach out to the tribe, but the tribe needs to respond in some way. Otherwise, it's just a notification. And so I'm well aware of the fact that the legislative and legal process and sometimes our frameworks don't allow the necessary flexibility that we would like. But I think that when we're good stewards of cultural resources, that we make the good faith effort of not only doing a letter, maybe following up with an email or even a phone call, or doing all three, better yet, and ensuring that the tribe has an opportunity, even if it's only very, very informally on a phone conversation, to have some kind of an input on a project, shows a meaningful and good faith effort. I think what happens is, unfortunately, there's an attempt by some agencies to minimize the effort because of the need to move projects forward. And in some cases, a tendency to not see it as a necessary component. I would also argue that there's a capacity issue at the tribes, and that tribes are working triage. They have unfunded mandates to do all the same work that you're doing, and only a third of them are receiving any funding, and that funding isn't sufficient for the level of work that they do on reservation, let alone what's off reservation with the tribe's area of interest. So we need to work for ways to identify funding mechanisms so that there's an opportunity for tribes to be able to meaningfully dialogue and engage in the process, as well as get access to information. So I do think that there's a lot of growth room here and opportunity, but I think that it's an ongoing conversation that requires multiple partners to be wanting to engage in the process, because the end result is not only a better product, but creates a better process for all the parties to meaningfully engage and identify these resources. And I would argue that these resources aren't just important to Indigenous communities, they're important to the larger public at large. And that when we make the advocacy as an individual Indigenous community, that advocacy is helping the larger. But we have to know what those resources are, where they're at, and be able to engage. And that means having an equal footing. And information is is the weapon of the day. And ultimately, those who have it can play, and those who don't have a hard time getting a place at the table. And so this was our method of creating an additional line of information that we could utilize to capitalize on consultation. And I think that because it's recreatable, because it's something that any other community can adapt to their needs, that it has some value. Do I think it's a fix-all? No. As a matter of fact, I think it created problems too, but finding its useful components and how it can be utilized by the community may be more beneficial than looking at the small disadvantages that it has given. And I think Brees would be better at answer that, since they keep improving it and not throwing it away. So,
well, I'm going to leapfrog a little bit in terms of what could a 3.0 look like that actually kind of diverges a little bit, but actually becomes meaningful for agencies, and especially land managing agencies. I'm going to be very bounded by that. But if you're a land managing agency, as Eric keeps pointing out, you have the unfunded mandate of 110. You have all of your undertaking obligations with 106 and elsewhere. And let's just take Department of Interior alone. You have multiple data recording systems within it that don't necessarily talk with each other, let alone talk outward through, except only through very prescriptive, very offensive data share agreements that undermine tribal sovereignty. However, this is also an amazing opportunity to say, why not agency or department with your respective agencies come up with a mechanism that brings your information into a single center of understanding. Yes, Herculean effort. Who's best handled to do that? There's an opportunity to contract tribes. Second step, in doing that, land managing areas or land agency managed lands may cross or be points of loci that multiple tribes have interest in and have their own vocabulary and their own concerns. Here is actually an opportunity to say, tribes, we are sharing out to you. If you have your own, just check yes or no. Now the agencies are obligated to go, Tribe X has knowledge of this area. We need to go contact them about this. And that may be a way of bringing issues of language, of objects, belongings, what the agency may refer to as biface or unifacially formed lithic may be actually referred to something else internally. Here is a way to bring that acknowledgement that that knowledge exists elsewhere. It doesn't reside with the tribe, it resides elsewhere. So that's an opportunity to see this concept actually go out and grow so that it has that greater meaningfulness, but it upholds that sovereignty, self-determination element, and it brings parity to knowledge so that in consultation, parity is achieved. It's not a power imbalance of agency telling the tribe what is occurring, but there is an equal element of, oh, you know more than I do in this way. I know more about what our process is in this way. Now we have respect and parity can occur. That for Grand Ronde starts to look like meaningful consultation. So yeah, I like Brad's comment. 110 is unfunded only by virtue of not being funded.
No comment. We are getting close to the end of the day, so I want to give anyone else an opportunity to speak before we start thinking about anything else. So please, if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, you want to throw a rock at me, there's got to be at least one out there. I know Brees does. He's just waiting to get closer to me.
Oh, no. I will say this, and this is just very personal. I have done a lot in my career. This is the most meaningful project I've ever been able to be a part of. It will outlive me, and as it should. And it is a refreshing moment to know that it will and has spurred so much else. And that's a very personal perspective about this. And I think that the more opportunities there are for individuals in community or outside of community to participate, we can start to get closer to that 3-degree change 10, 20 years down the road.
I'd add on to that. When I was at NOAA, it's interesting from my perspective, this sort of came about out of necessity, and something that I had also been talking to Dave Ball about, whose wherever he is, his ears are burning right now, independently. And so he recognized an opportunity to put some pieces together. But and
the original TCL was a weird, unique thing.
Had the foresight to make an investment and seeing whether things could be done differently. And just it's been one of the blessings of my life for that project to come together with y'all and be able to do it at the time, and to see the life that it's taken on now, both here and in agency land, has been incredibly gratifying. And I feel so fortunate and blessed to be able to continue to work on this. And I would agree with that, Brees. It was an amazing professional opportunity, but we also had a lot of fun together and a great rapport as a team. And I'm loving your comment here, Elizabeth, that incorporating into your district's practices, that's exactly what we want. That's what we'd like to see. So thanks for that. We appreciate it.
I'm going to jump on what Val and Brees said. This project keeps living on. It's over a decade now, and it is now in its 4th iteration overall. And it's creating opportunities that when I originally proposed and threw this out there, I was simply looking for an opportunity to put a few tribal members to work. I didn't think it would create opportunities to deepen consultation, but it had that unintended consequence. And as a result of that, I've been very happy to help show how the methodology worked and the approach to other folks so that they can see how elements of this can be incorporated into their own work to improve overall cultural resource management and consultation. And I'll just say thank you to Val and Brees and to Dave Ball and all the other folks that worked on the original TCL project. And for all those folks who are working on the newest iterations in those tribal communities and at Udall and Bohm, because I think that if this wasn't successful, it wouldn't be being repeated. And I think that's valuable to note. I think the other thing is that, again, it's just another tool. So look and see if it's adaptable to what you need. And if it is, I'm glad that we can provide another option and opportunity to help. And if it isn't, I appreciate that you guys took the opportunity to come and spend a few hours with us so that we could share with you one of our wonderful projects.
So we have not yet scheduled the part 2 of the workshop. We are planning to do that in the coming weeks so that we can hold that within the calendar year, and you will hear it here First, having registered for this, you are on our list now, so be sure and keep an eye out for emails from us. And if you don't start getting them, check your spam, since we know that that can be an issue. And if you're planning to attend the part 2, not just keep an eye out for that, but also I'd like to ask that you do some homework and take what you've heard today and think about how you would start applying it, so that you can come ready to ask questions and use our experts to discuss moving the ball forward in your community, what you need to make that happen. We'd love to discuss that as well. So we really want the next part to be a working session. So that is our request. If you're planning to attend that, and please, let's see, Eric and Brees, can you put your email address in the chat box here? Everybody knows how to get in touch with me. It's Valerie@nathpo.org. Please reach out at any time with questions or comments, not just about this and leading to the second part of the workshop, but also about anything else. We are here to serve, and the range of needs is very great, and our capacity is limited but growing as well. And so any feedback about things that we may be doing better, or questions you may have, if we don't have the answers, we can connect you with someone who probably does, because there's not much that's new out there. It's just a matter of connecting people, keeping the communication open, and building partnerships, and trying to find ways to empower you all to do the work that you're doing. So that being said, there is contact information in the chat box. I will pause and see if anyone has any last questions. Hearing none, I'm going to borrow a page from project meetings that we've been having on a separate effort. We like to end the meetings with an exercise called rock, stick, or leaf. And maybe you've heard this before. But if anyone would like to share by way of concluding the meeting, something that you heard today that rocked you, or that stuck with you, or that you will leave here with. We will open it up.
Well, since nobody's saying anything, I will say that something that has rocked me is the fact that we had so many participants. We had almost 200 people register, and I think we had over 110 at some point. So that's amazing to me. That really rocks. Lorianne?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lorianne from Barbara and your Band of Chumash Indians. You know, I really want to take the time to thank you for allowing us to be here, and, you know, and having future meetings. Me as a Culture Resource Committee in Santa Barbara, we're just a very small tribal organization, 501c3, but this is actually very informative and very useful as a cultural resource monitor here in our town. And so I just want to thank you. It's very informative, and I'm learning so much. So thank you.
Thanks for that. I see Chelsea's comment in the chat here too, Eric. We have always picked berries here. means it's of cultural importance.
Well, I guess I'll share then. I think my shock is that when I originally made that proposal, would have never figured that 11 or 12 years later, I'd still be having the same conversation about the same project. I thought it was a lark, and I thought that we were just thumbing the eye in the agency. And I continue to be amazed at the unique circumstance of all the right people being at the right place at the right time to start the conversation, because otherwise it would have been missed.
Stars align. All right, well, it looks like we're giving folks about 15 minutes back. Thank you everyone for joining today. We're so grateful that you take the time to come and participate in our events. Thanks to Brees, thanks to Eirik, gosh, for everything. Thanks to my team, Julia, Melissa. We were really excited about this one, and it hasn't disappointed. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the working session holds. Thank you to our tribal participants. Thank you especially to our agency participants. You know, there's two parts to bringing this reality into reality and normalizing it. And so we're so grateful that you come here to listen and to talk and to share. And we look forward to continuing the discussion with you. We're going to wrap it up and stop recording, and the link will be sent to all registrants afterward, probably next week, and we will also post it on our website. So if this was a fire hydrant of information, we realized that you can go and watch it again. And as I said, please be sure and reach out to us at any time. We have an open door for questions and comments and brainstorming. And we look forward to continuing the discussion and, you know, ideally working with you all on making this a reality, empowering tribal voices to speak and represent your own places, as I think it was said several times, you're the authority on your own history. And this is an exciting time to be doing this work. I think we're experiencing a paradigm shift, and it's really exciting and gratifying and humbling to be a part of it. So thanks everyone, and we will see you next time. Have fun out there. Take care.